check something for me?
What happened? What's up?
Can you open this YouTube link here and check if there is somebody online? Live stream is running there.
Okay.
Is it running? Is it high quality?
Yeah, it looks fine.
Really?
Yeah.
How is... Can you, is it not jittery? Is the sound good?
Yeah,
Mixing?
it's all good.
How is the latency and streaming? All good?
Yes,
Okay.
everything's fine.
Crazy. Great. Okay. Cool.
Oh.
Lay down over here. Oh, fuck.
Cool. That's great,
All over this blanket. Lay down.
I guess. You're, where are you at right now?
Black hole.
Really? Didn't we want to do Belsavis first?
It's fine, I'm already here.
Okay. you get all the quests? Even
Yeah.
the tiny one from the droid over here. Did you get that one too? This one? Right here. Did you pick
Hold
it?
on, I'm redeeming things that I got from past.
Key. Did you get the mission?
Yeah.
Every little mission?
Yeah.
You know the line? Then let's do it. Let's do it. Do it.
Dreams do come true.
Take it. Follow me. Back here. These guys. You see them? You need to be near them when they die. No! Did you? Aww. I didn't get that. Did I? You need to work with me together, man.
Alright, that's all 15 of those done.
Yeah, you need to stay with me, man. Come on. Press the chest. Push it. Let's go. Okay, now wait. Okay, that's it, right? We got it done. I need a few more guns. Did you get all 4 of those chests?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I got all the weapons, let's go. This way.
In here.
No, follow me. Okay. You need to loot that guy. We don't need to kill those guys anymore.
Yeah, I
need to
didn't
loot
mean
that.
to attack him.
Yeah, you need to loot that guy. That gold.
I did already.
So you finished that mission. Let's go.
Oh, it's this one.
Hmm?
I remember this one.
Yeah, just wait. Wait, don't follow me, don't follow me. Go back and away. Don't wait. Buddy, I can't work it when you're pulling mobs here. Go back to the entrance, please. Let me do it solo. It's faster. You can try it out when you're alone. Oh man, I can't do it. Why are you pulling mobs, really? This is
I
annoying.
can kill them myself.
Yeah, but I cannot progress the quest when there is enemies around. God damn it.
Okay.
It interrupts my clicking. Let's go, follow me. Go, go, go.
I'm coming. I'm down.
Go, go. Up the mountain. Let's go. Follow me. Hey. Hurry, hurry, or the curry gets cold. This way. Click those boxes right here. You click
What
down
boxes?
those shield cells. They have a little button on the right side. A little blue
They're not
button
fucking here, man. Turn AC on. Gang!
right here. See?
Hot fuck, turn AC on.
Yeah, right here.
Turn
See?
the fucking
This
light switch
one?
off.
Hello? Right here, look.
You can't turn the goddamn light switch off. It's fucking pain.
This one. See this one?
That would be one.
Click that. Let's go.
Hey, it's all the time. Walk up to the parking lot. Oh, that's cool.
Oh. Loot that one. Can you wait here? Don't go into the water, okay? Just stay right next to it. Come close, okay? Right in front of it. So it counts for you. Are you in range? Did it count? You need to
Yes.
come in range. Okay.
Oh, then I gotta go back outside.
Did it
I've
count?
got
Did
two.
you get 2?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Go back outside.
Good.
This isn't my first time playing this, you know.
Yeah, it's okay. It kills a lot of people. I prefer to do it myself.
Well, I was waiting for myself up there. Shit, dude, hey. Get your ass off.
Huh?
Get your ass off. What's hot dog? It's simple fucking shit. A hot dog. Oh.
I don't never.
Ach, so. Sehr schön.
I'll be back.
Yeah, $18 an hour. $18 an hour. 18 hours a week. $600.
I'll be back in a few minutes.
Okay.
Dude, I'm tired. I've got a coffee. I'd like to have meat. You know? Like, we're not gonna fucking
The future.
Treibstoffrationierung. Besucher der Station werden nach Prioritätsreihenfolge betankt. Wir entschuldigen uns für etwaige Unannehmlichkeiten.
Car outside. Why am I on one? Fucking lunatic around here. Holy fuck. Oh. Anyway, where the fuck was I? Where was I? I probably would. You're doing your job, girl. Turn you loose. Look what happens. You do good things. Oh, you mean a Tom? Liz, where's Tom at? You in the fucking... That one.
Ah.
flow. Cause well is I'm shiny, maybe I will pay my war. My money white clothes, bike records, if you're sexy we can go. Straight from the big Sao Paulo, I can bring the best cocoa. Girls with street, I make their ass bounce, bitches really love my flow. Cause well is I'm shiny, maybe I will pay my war. My money white clothes, bike records, if you're sexy we can go. Swell is I'm from the big Sao Paulo, bounce, bitches really love my flow.
könnte ich machen? Das hier könnte ich machen. Ich könnte ein Audiobuch anmachen.
To Lakeshire, to his mother and brother and sister and Rob. Aram was somehow sure of it. The compass somehow knew the way home. Of course, that wouldn't make getting there any easier. Nevertheless, Aram felt his soul lighten. He had seen the compass as a burden, and because he had thought it broken, a ridiculous burden at that. But now he could view the compass as a gift. A last gift from a father he'd never see again. He wiped a dirty, salt-encrusted arm across his eyes, stinging them into further tears. Then he pushed the feelings down and away. He couldn't face them now. Mikasa repeated, "What are you on about?" Having choked back his emotions, Aram stared at the map, trying to find something, anything to say other than the truth of what he was feeling. And again, there it was. Gadgetzan, capital of the Steamweedle Goblin Trade Cartel, and home of the helpful Charnas, lay to the southeast, practically in a direct line between where he knelt and Lakeshire. He said, "Here's Gadgetzan. As the crow flies, it's the nearest large port, and it's neutral territory. We won't have to worry about the Horde. I can find a ship there." He pulled a gold coin from his pocket. "Use this to book passage home." She studied the map, shook her head. "Gadgetzan's not close at all. We should head for Feathermoon Stronghold, up the coast to the north. There's a military outpost there controlled by the Night Elves, by the Alliance. Some trade, too. Even something akin to civilization, at least by the standards of Kalimdor. The odds of me finding a ship to the Eastern Kingdoms from there are pretty slim. The odds of you surviving a trek across Feralis are slimmer. There are gnolls here, murlocs, bears, hippogriffs, yetis, and don't forget the ogres. We're trekking across Feralis no matter which way we head. The coast and the interior are hardly the same thing. You have no idea the kind of terrain we'd be crossing, inland, across Feralis. I probably don't. But if we go to Feathermoon, I'm no closer to home. You'd be stuck with me still. But you get me to Gadgetzan, and you can consider your life debt paid." Mikasa started to object, but fell silent. Aram watched her convince herself that finally throwing off the burden of Aramar Thorn, after 6 months aboard ship and 3 nights aboard that dinghy, would make her happy. He could almost see the idea of Gadgetzan lighten the soul of Mikasa Flintwill, too. She pulled out a packet of hardtack, opened it, and offered half to the boy. "Well, what are we waiting for?" she said, and they trudged off. Following the compass, they maintained a southeasterly heading. The shores had been rocky and bare, but within 10 minutes they were trudging through a dense rainforest. The air was thick, the vines were thicker. The canopy of trees rose above them like ceilings of great halls in the stories of castles his mother had told him as a young child. He had never seen so many different shades of green. He felt an immediate urge to climb a tree, to leap from branch to branch above the loamy turf, to somehow paint the colors of the forest into his sketchbook. He longed to explore Feralis, not by crossing it, but in an upward spiral. His pace slowed. He approached the mast-like tree with the bittersweet memory of a climbing Duan Fen filling his thoughts. He would ascend this tree in her honor. "Keep up," Mikasa barked at him, breaking the spell for the moment. He trudged on behind her. This environment might be one Aram had never experienced before, but it was one in which Mikasa felt right at home. She used her cutlass like a machete, but didn't care for what that was doing to its blade. Aram offered her the hatchet. It was small for the purpose, but Mikasa Flintwill was a young woman of precision, and so it served her well enough. Mosquitoes buzzed around Aram's eyes and ears, driving him nearly insane. And the farther in they marched, the larger the mosquitoes seemed to grow. Soon they were as big as hummingbirds, big enough for Mikasa to chop one or two in half, right out of midair. The going was slow. The forest became less and less romantic. Sweat poured down Aram's brow. It mixed with the dried blood on his forehead. And when he wiped another arm across his face, it came back bloody. And for a second he panicked, until he remembered the smack on the head the night before. His mouth was dry, and he was starting to feel a bit lightheaded again. "Water," he croaked. She looked back at him, over her shoulder. She scowled, of course. But then she nodded and knelt down. She tore up some thick vines and then snapped one in half. "Open your mouth," she said. "Tilt your head back." He was dubious, but complied, and she poured the liquid contents of the vine into him. It was warm, but otherwise surprisingly clean and fresh-tasting. She snapped another vine open and drank herself. He reached for another vine that was growing up the side of a tree. She slapped his hand away. "Not that kind," she said. "Note the difference in color." "They're both green," he groused angrily. All thoughts of the differing hues he had so recently admired seemed a trivial annoyance just then. "The difference in shade, then. See, this sea-green vine runs along the ground. That's what you want. Those pea-green tree vines that grow near Fadeleaf contain traces of poison. Probably not enough to kill you, but enough to make you too sick to walk or fend for yourself. And if you think I'm prepared to carry you out of here on my back, you've got another thing coming." Aram suspected that if push came to shove, Mikasa would, in fact, carry him out on her back. But he didn't want to poison himself to test his theory, so he simply nodded. She pointed to the vines running slightly downhill along the ground. "Also, these should lead us to an actual water source." And they did, a small stream bed overflowing from the recent rain, where both knelt and drank their fill. Aram washed the blood from his face and looked at his reflection in the water. He had a not insignificant bump on his head, but he was otherwise not too worse for wear. They followed the stream for a time. Mikasa, who had ever been on the alert, seemed particularly watchful now. "What is it?" he said. "We need something we can use for canteens," she said. He didn't see how that was possible, but soon Mikasa stopped in front of a stand of tall, spur-covered plants bearing large spur-covered fruit, which Mikasa called palm apples. She cut two largish ones off the plant, borrowed the hunting knife, sat on a log, and went to work, carefully carving out a cork-size hole high up on each palm apple. She gave one of the palm apples to Aram and picked out 2 sticks. She instructed Aram how to use his stick to mash up the soft fruit within the husk. Periodically, they'd stop to pour out yellow palm apple juice into their mouths. It was sweet as nectar, but lighter, more refreshing. Still, it was a long and painstaking process that took them a good hour. But when they were done, they had created 2 canteens out of the husks. She held them under water, and Aram watched the air bubble out. She pulled them up and handed one to him. He poured a short sip into his mouth. The water was cool and tasted of sweet palm apple. She handed him a cork, and he sealed the receptacle. He held it upside down to test it. A tiny bit of water trickled out, but for the most part, Mikasa's creations were a complete success. And, as they walked on and the stream twisted to the southwest, they became essential. None of Mikasa's knowledge or skills particularly surprised Aram. He didn't much enjoy her company, but he had never once doubted her abilities. They kept walking. The heat and humidity rose with the sun, despite the fact that the canopy of trees provided them with near-constant shade. Mikasa seemed not to notice, but Aram was sweating like a pig and rapidly tiring. After another hour, He was relieved when Mikasa stopped, giving him the mistaken impression they might rest. But instead, she squatted down near flattened grass to study some fresh, stinking scat on the ground. Aram, who had perhaps imbibed a bit too much palm apple, felt his gorge rise, but managed to swallow it back down. Suddenly, Mikasa whispered, "Stay here," and took off at a run, her tall body bent nearly in half to avoid hanging vines. Aram had only a vague idea of what she was up to, but he drew his cutlass and stood at the ready for her to flush out, well, whatever she was attempting to flush out. Minutes passed. The palm apple canteen in one hand and the cutlass in the other were both starting to get heavy. The heat was oppressive, and he began to grow drowsy, his eyes drifting closed and jerking open, his head sinking slowly and jerking back up. Then he heard the distinct sound of metal cracking wood. That woke him up. Then he heard another, stranger noise. At first he couldn't fathom what it might be, but as it approached he realized it was Mikasa, and she was whooping? Yes, Mikasa Flintwill, no more than 100 yards away and closing, was swinging her iron chain over her head and whooping like a lunatic. It wasn't exactly a dignified sound, and a week ago he would never in a million years have imagined it emanating from his current traveling companion. But there it was. Then there it was. A great boar, easily 2 feet high, 2 feet wide, and 4 feet long, was bearing down on Aramar Thorn. Its curved white tusks, backed by a massive head and brawny shoulders, seemed more than equal to Aram's cutlass. But he stood his ground. The boar lowered its bristling head to better aim its tusks at Aram's guts, when Aram heard metal whistling through the air. Suddenly, the boar seemed to grow a harpoon haft out of its back. The boar stumbled and rolled, took Aram's legs out from under him, and deposited the boy on his face, reopening the cut on his forehead. Still, the end result was boar meat for supper. But not venison, because despite her prowess as a hunter and tracker, Mikasa never even noticed the huge stag watching the proceedings from the trees. Chapter 15. The Feast of Lord Bloodhorn. They dubbed their meal Lord Bloodhorn, and the good fellow served them well. Mikasa had prepared the meat, while Aram, raised beside a forge, collected wood and started a small fire. He also went searching for water and found another small stream not far away, where he drank, washed again, drank again, and filled both canteens. The night cooled off considerably, but they were comfortable beside the fire, eating their fill. Aram even grew complacent, lying back on the green turf with his hands folded behind his head, his eyes closed, and a sated grin on his face. But with a kick to his thigh to get his attention, Mikasa reminded him to remain on the alert for predators, not to mention ogres. Nevertheless, killing her own supper seemed to have put Mikasa in a better mood than usual. It didn't suddenly make her a sparkling conversationalist, but she too gave off an air of contentment, which to Aram was a considerable improvement over her typical demeanor. He pulled out his sketchbook and began sharpening his coal pencil with a knife. For a time, she just watched him work. In fact, she waited so long to get around to saying her standard, "You better not be putting me in that blasted book," that Aram nearly forgot to reply. But he summoned up his, "I promise I won't sketch you unless you ask me to," as he tried to sketch his father from memory. It didn't come easy. The coat helped a bit. He pulled the collar around his face and inhaled deeply, and perhaps imagined the smell of his father surrounding him. But he still couldn't get his efforts to come out right. Was that his father's nose? And that didn't seem at all like Graydon's smile. He frowned at the sketch. He realized his memory of his father's features was already dimming. It had only been 4 days. What would he remember of Graydon Thorn in a month? By the time Aram made it back to Lakeshore, would the man be reduced to the kind of shadow he had been to his son 6 months ago? 6 months ago, Aram was told to put his brother and sister to bed. Celia had been fussy. Every time he had started to leave her room, she had said, "Don't go, Aram." He stayed with her until she fell asleep, so it was nearly an hour before he returned to the hearth to find his mother, Rob, and Graydon speaking in low tones about him. They quieted when Saya noticed Aram and gently touched both men on their shoulders. Graydon stood abruptly. "I'll be at the inn," he said. No one made any attempt to convince him to stay at the Glade cottage. He turned to his former wife. "Think about it. I'll be back in the morning." He left without another word. "Think about what?" Aram asked. "He's leaving for Stormwind Harbor tomorrow," his mother said. Aram darkened. "Well, he has been here a whole day. He wants you to go with him." "What?" Rob said. "He wants you to join his crew for a year." Aram's heart raced. Childhood dreams of the sea momentarily filled his vision. How many years had he dreamed of exactly this, of sailing beside Graydon Thorn, of exploring the great wide world of Azeroth? But almost immediately, those childhood dreams seemed childish, irresponsible like Graydon Thorn. A man who could go to sea and leave his wife and child behind, with no word, no coin, no concern. That wasn't the kind of man Aramar Thorn wanted to be. And anyway, if Graydon really wanted Aram, wouldn't he have asked his son himself? Aram became aware his parents were staring at him, waiting. Finally, he said, "He never mentioned that to me." His mother said, "He wanted to make sure he had our approval first." Rob rolled his eyes, and Saya acknowledged, "He wanted my approval first." "Well, tell him no," Aram said quickly. "Why?" said Saya and Rob almost in unison. Because I'm apprenticed at the forge." "We can get you out of that," Rob said with a wry smile. "I know the blacksmith." "Then tell him no because I don't know him. Because I don't want to go. I don't want to leave you two or Robertson or Celia. Besides, I love Lakeshire. This is my home. I'm not a sailor. I'm a blacksmith." Aram watched them both nod absently. It seemed settled. And then it didn't. "He'll be back in the morning," Rob said. "You don't have to decide right now." "It might be different if he stayed for a while," Aram said. "But I'm not going to change my mind about him in one night. He abandoned us. I don't trust him. I don't like him. He should have stayed dead." Saya bit her lip. Rob shook his head. "Don't say that, boy." "Fine. I'm sorry, but it is what it is." "It is what it is" was one of Rob's favorite truisms. Aram thought he'd scored a couple points with it. "Go to bed," Rob said crossly. Aram rounded up Soot and took the dog to bed with him. A few minutes later, his parents retired to their room, which had a common wall with the chamber he shared with his brother. Rob and Saya were up late talking. Aram couldn't make out their words, but he could hear his mother crying and Rob trying to comfort her. Her son thought Graydon Thorn responsible for her tears, and they made him angry with the man. Well, angrier. He was sure he'd never fall asleep, but the rhythm of Soot's breathing beside him eventually lulled him into slumber. He should have stayed dead. Had he really said that? He thought he could feel his heart crumbling to dust in his chest. Talk about ridiculous. The way his feelings for Graydon could swing between extremes was truly preposterous to Aram, even perverse. But it was what it was. Aram missed his father. And the guilt of leaving him behind to die, of tearing up his picture, of harsh words said and thought and felt, rushed back at Aram like the seas crashing over the rocks of Feralis. "By the gods, I'm a brat," he said. He saw Mikasa's eyebrow rise half an inch and belatedly realized he had spoken out loud. "You're just realizing that now," she said with a happy growl. "Yeah, actually." This answer seemed to surprise her. She sat up. She bit her lip, an unconscious gesture that stunned Aram, and not just because this woman, who seemed completely devoid of anything resembling maternal feeling, had, for one brief moment, actually reminded him of his mother. No, What stunned him most was the sense of indecision that bite on the lip represented. She said he wasn't perfect, but he loved you. Saying the word love out loud seemed to leave a bad taste in her mouth, but she forged on. You were all that mattered. That's not true, Aram said, a knee-jerk reaction, but he softened. I mean, I wasn't all that mattered to him. There was something else. She started to protest, but he stopped her. He told me there was something else. He just never got around to telling me what. Then he was out of time. And now, we'll probably never know. She actually nodded. He said, but the thing is, I always pretended that because something else mattered to him, that meant I didn't. And I know that's not true. I've always known that. But by the gods, you're a brat. He shrugged his acquiescence. They were silent for a time. Aram watched her. She had turned her thoughts inward, and that introspection made her look young. It made her look her age. She was 17, but behaved as if she were 30. Usually, her inherent competence and cranky disposition lent credence to the illusion. But not just now. You loved him, he said. What? She barked back at him, suddenly outraged. She stood and pulled her harpoon out of the ground, as if she might skewer him with it. Sorry. I'm asking. Did you love him? Her hand gripped and re-gripped the iron weapon. When she spoke again, he thought he could hear that her throat had gone dry. I respected him, she croaked. I wanted him to respect me. He thought, yes, that's all true, but that's not the whole truth. She offered him a life debt, but thought, they'd moved beyond it. That much she's already admitted. The rest now seemed almost obvious, or obvious enough that he wondered why he hadn't seen it months before. After 2 years aboard ship, standing beside Graydon Thorne, Mikasa had come to love him like a father. I know she did. I was his son, but whether she knew it or not, she wanted to be his daughter. It was one reason why she and I never got along, could never get along. I came aboard and took her place. It didn't help that I didn't seem to want it, nor that I didn't seem to deserve it. He said, I mattered to him. I know that now. A bit late, she said, scowling again and staring down at the fire. It was hard to see, he said, because no matter how much I mattered, it was you he valued. Her eyes snapped up to meet his, to test them for sincerity. But that was an easy test for Aram to pass, because he sincerely believed Graydon valued Mikasa more than any person in Azeroth. Get some sleep, she said, not unkindly. And then more harshly and in character, we're up at dawn and walking. He left the sketch unfinished for the time being and put the pencil and book away. Chapter 16. The Hidden. Days passed. Nights, too. Lord Bloodhorn lasted them a good long time, and Mikasa was even able to dry, tan, and sew a crude pack from his hide. Many of their meager supplies were transferred to this pack, including the canteens and oil flask. Their long march had begun to climb uphill and carry them above the canopy. The area should still have been lush, but tree after tree had been cut down, leaving only stumps. Mikasa examined them and declared with certainty that the damage had been done by axe blades too large to have been wielded by anything smaller than an ogre. Thus, they were constantly, exhaustingly, on the alert and continued to sleep in shifts. Aram awoke one night to find Mikasa stabbing at a rock viper that had slithered within 5 inches of his neck. Without the shade of the trees, the heat and humidity grew oppressive. Other plants were scorched and withered by the bright, unforgiving sun, and the lack of flora had clearly had an effect on the fauna. Mikasa had flushed out no more game, and had seen little sign that more game existed, other than the poisonous snakes, which she was afraid to cook and eat because she couldn't be certain the snake flesh would be free of venom. No more palm apples were to be found either. Fortunately, despite the heat, water wasn't a problem. thanks to the occasional runoff from the frequent rains. But when it came to food, they were rationing out the hardtack again. Aram had taken to checking the compass with frustrating regularity. Frustrating because it told him so little. He studied it, even sketched it. The casing was brass. The face was white, with initials marking north, south, east, and west, filigreed in gold. The needle was a sliver of crystal, which consistently pointed southeast. To Mikasa, he said they were maintaining a direct route to Gadgetzan. It wasn't a lie. Their map of Kalimdor confirmed his claim. But in his heart, he felt each step was really bringing him closer to Lakeshire. But there was nothing to consult that could reveal how many days they'd have to walk before reaching Gadgetzan, or whether there'd be a ship there to take him home. Nevertheless, whether ascending or resting, he continued to consult the compass, as if maybe this time, new information would be provided. Mikasa observed this new habit, and came very close to adding it to her long list of things to harass Aram about, but she didn't. At first, she couldn't quite put a finger on why. Eventually, however, she knew. Graydon had checked the compass in the exact same manner. And every time he checked it, the result was the same facial expression of frustration bordering on disappointment that Aram was offering up now. Mikasa Flintwill missed her captain, and Aram was bringing the man back to her in some small measure. So she said nothing, lest he stop. A part of her still prayed that Captain Thorne had somehow defeated the pirates and retaken Wavestrider, that the ship had limped to port and was now undergoing repair of the mainmast, that it would set out in search of them soon. But the former second mate knew she'd never have allowed Aram to talk her into heading inland, away from any chance of regaining their ship and rejoining its crew. If for one moment she truly believed any of that fantasy possible. No, Mikasa was too practical to lie to herself. By now, Graydon, Thorne, and the rest of the crew were dead at the pirates' hands. Assuming the pirates were pirates at all, Mikasa had her doubts on that score. There were still too many unanswered questions. For starters, she was forced to agree with Aram's earlier observation. In possession of Cobb's intelligence, it seemed unlikely that a standard pirate crew would have much interest in Wavestrider's cargo. The ship itself was a prize, but she had witnessed how little concern the pirate captain had had for leaving said prize undamaged. And what about that pirate captain? He had known Captain Thorne, and Thorne had known him, had called him a traitorous dog. What was their history? And when Graydon Thorne had told her and Aram, "There's more at stake than either of you realize," what had he meant? What was at stake? She longed to know, but despaired of ever finding out. Maybe the pirates weren't pirates at all. Yet it changed nothing. The pirates, meanwhile, made landfall in Feralas. The tar ship, called the Inevitable by its crew, was anchored off the coast, while a longboat carried its elite toward shore. Malice, their leader, watched as the muscle of the group, the ogre Throg, rowed fiercely, using, in lieu of his missing hand, an iron clamp tightly screwed into the rapidly splintering wood of the oar's handle. They'd be lucky if the oar made it to shore intact. And it frustrated Malice that, short of rowing himself, he could get no one else to take on this mundane chore. Their swordsman, the undead regal Valdred, had made a great show of offering his services, only to tear his left arm completely off his shoulder with his very first pull of the oars. He was all whispered apologies as he reattached the arm, but Malice could clearly hear the amused insincerity in Valdred's barely audible protestations of regret. Malice had then looked to their tracker, Zathra, but the troll simply curled her lip into a scowl and said, "The sea be no place for a sand troll. I not be rowing for you, man." That left only their sorcerer, Sarbeak. But Malice hadn't even bothered to ask the strange, robe-enshrouded Arakoa, now hissing relentlessly to himself through his sharp, curved beak in the boat's stern. To begin with, the foul creature's bird-like body and feathered limbs weren't well suited for the task, and neither was his arrogant demeanor. Sarbeak barely paid beak service to being under Malice's command, and Malice was too practical to fool himself into thinking otherwise. So he watched Throg row and watched the oar handle splinter. The longboat drew near the rocky coastline. From the deck of the Inevitable, Zathra had spotted bits of wreckage among the shoals, and now that they were closer, she was able to confirm they were the remains of a small boat or dinghy. "The dinghy from Thorn's ship?" Malice demanded. She glared at him. "Now how I to know that?" "How long has the wreckage been there?" "Get me closer and I tell you." Malice seethed at her casually insolent tone. This group was deadly and efficient. The successful attack on and sinking of the Wave Strider had demonstrated that. But they were hardly a cohesive unit. Sarbeak, of course, had his own agenda. Zathra was a mercenary, a professional. She took the job and would complete it. But she had no interest in Malice's cause, and he knew it. And Valdred? Like the troll, he was for hire, accepting gold in exchange for his services and his sword. But truth be told, Valdred had only signed on out of sheer boredom, not a motivation Malice could count on if things got uninteresting, or too interesting. He hadn't forgotten, or forgiven, that Valdred had nearly blown the entire operation by approaching Graydon Thorn prematurely in Flair's Point. No, only Throg the truly dim was truly loyal to his master. In fact, loyalty all but defined the ogre. Even his missing hand was a symbol of that quality, having been taken years ago as proof of allegiance to the orcs of the Shattered Hand clan. Throg rowed as close to shore as he dared without scuttling them on the rocks. Crouching in the bow, Zathra leaned forward, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the wreckage. "Been there a week," she said. "It be the boat from the ship." "Or a startling coincidence," whispered Valdred.
"I do not believe in coincidences,"
hissed Sarbeak. His sibilant voice, unusual even for an Arakoa, grated on everyone aboard, even the Whisper Man.
"No place to land,"
Throg stated.
"Throg head south till we."
But already the Arakoa had begun his chant.
"We are the hidden, the voyagers of shadow. We serve and will conquer. What we conquer will burn. Bend to the master's will. Bend to the hidden. Bend. Bend."
The water darkened and swirled around the boat. The air seemed charged with static. Shadows in the bottom of the boat twisted and writhed. Throg and Zathra growled low in disturbed unison. Malice scowled, the hair on his arms prickling up to attention. Valdred's opinion was unknowable under his hood. And still, Sarbeak intoned,
"Bend. Bend. Bend."
With a lurch, the dark water lifted the boat upward. It landed with a crack of its keel upon the shore, just above the dinghy's wreckage, and, in fact, smack atop where Mikasa's harpoon had struck earth. Malice couldn't help noting that the damage to Throg's oar hardly mattered now that the entire longboat had been rendered unsound. Valdred removed his hood, revealing blanched white skin, stretched tight over his skull-shaped head with its somewhat permanent skeletal grin.
"Well, that saved some time,"
he whispered. Throg unclamped himself from the oar and stood up in the boat, tipping it. The others were quick enough to leap clear, all but Sarbeak, who was tossed out, face first, into the mud. Scampering up and trying to cover the indignity with fury, the Arakoa hissed,
"Fool, you will suffer."
"Enough," Malice said. Sarbeak might not like it, but Malice was still in command. "We haven't the time to fight among ourselves. Zathra, earn your keep."
"That be some trick, mon. Since the mudbird here wiped out their traces with this boat and his clumsy self."
Sarbeak wheeled on the troll, but she leveled a crossbow between his eyes, and the Arakoa shrunk back, hissing. Malice tried not to smile.
Find new traces,
he said. Zathra scanned the surrounding area. Then she smiled and strode toward the edge of the rainforest. They followed. At the tree line, she nodded to herself and said,
Here. They entered here, heading southeast.
What's southeast of nothing? Asked Valdred. His lidless eyes surveyed their surroundings and found them wanting. He raised his hood again. Malice considered.
If you march far enough, Gadgetzan. But why head toward Gadgetzan when Feathermoon's stronghold is so much closer?
Throg shrugged.
Maybe they don't know where they are.
Malice waved him silent.
Just because you don't know where we are.
But Throg took some umbrage and would not be silent even for his captain.
Throg know where we are. This is Feralas, Ogre Land.
He twisted the clamp off his wrist and replaced it with a machete.
They follow the compass,
hissed Sarbeak, catching Malice's eye.
Perhaps,
Malice said, before turning to Zathra and asking,
What's their lead?
7, 8 days.
Send it ahead,
he ordered.
Her,
the troll corrected.
She be a she.
Zathra tilted her head, clicked her tongue several times, and began stroking her body armor lovingly.
Wake up, little one,
she said, with something like affection. The armor clicked in response and moved, and then abruptly skittered off her torso and down one leg. Throg and Sarbeak took a step back. Malice didn't, only because he refused to show weakness. Valdred leaned against a tree and yawned. The sand troll knelt beside her pet, a 3-foot-long, tan scorpid with black markings. She stroked her the way a human child might stroke a kitten. The creature brandished her stinger and emitted a few clicking noises. Zathra clicked back. The others waited impatiently. When the troll finally spoke, her dry desert voice had a loving quality that was almost disturbing.
Skitter, my sister. Follow their trail. Find them. Then return to me.
They clicked at each other a few more times, and then Skitter whipped around and skittered into the rainforest. Zathra was still smiling after her scorpid when Malice said, "Lead the way." And so their tracker led the way, noting bends in the leaves and hatchet-hacked vines that marked their quarry's path, while leaving not a trace herself. Not that it mattered. The ogre followed the troll, using his machete hand to hack a wider lane for himself and the others. Captain Malice went next, and the Arakoa scampered after him, as if not trusting their leader otherwise. Valdred took up the rear, one hand on the hilt of his black sword. The cracked longboat and the inevitable itself were left behind, practically forgotten, as the hidden vanished into the forest, hot on the trail of Aramar Thorn. Chapter 17. Murky Depths. Since fleeing Wavestrider, they had been 3 days at sea, and 14 now, hiking across Feralas, and most of the latter uphill. Lord Bloodhorn was but a memory, and they were almost out of hardtack. The land they traversed continued to be barren and devoid of even small game, and Mikasa was on the verge of testing out the moss on the rocks for sustenance. The days were hot, even steamy, but the nights were cold, and colder still since firewood had grown scarce. Aram would wrap himself tight in his father's coat and still find himself shivering. Even water was becoming a problem. Their palm apple canteens had started to rot and had to be thrown away. There was still the occasional brook, but no way to carry water with them. Aram didn't like to leave their southeasterly course, but Mikasa was no longer willing to risk abandoning a water source. The next time they found a trickle, she insisted on following it upstream, even though it bent to the northeast. Aram checked the compass and sighed, but didn't argue. They marched on. The sound swelled so gradually it was practically a roar before it registered on their brains, and they had practically stumbled upon the river before they understood what they were hearing. The river's churning rapids carved a deep, forbidding gorge into the canyon. There was plenty of water here, but reaching it was not without its danger. Mikasa, as usual, making the decision for the both of them, skirted the edge, hoping for a safer way down, eventually. Aram pointed to a crevasse. "What about there?" He had to shout over the din of the flow. She said nothing until they were closer, but she didn't like the look of it and shook her head. Mikasa was far from timid and might have been willing to try her luck if she'd been alone. But the burden of watching out for the Graydon son had made her cautious. If he fell, or even if she did, she knew the boy would never survive. They continued on, Aram a few steps behind Mikasa. The low roar of the river filled Aram's ears, but something higher-pitched began to play along the edge of his consciousness as he walked along the edge of the gorge. What was that? Shouting? He leaned over the side, scanning for the source of the strange noise. He saw nothing, and at times he couldn't even hear it. Mikasa, who had walked on, glanced back to see Aram grasping a rock and bending almost horizontally over the gorge. "What are you doing?" she shouted. It startled him, and she watched with horror as his grip on the rock seemed to slip, but he held on and still persisted to lean over the edge. She stalked over to him, ready to pull him back by his earlobe, when she heard it too. Some strange cry emanating from below. "There!" Aram called out, pointing with his free hand down into the gorge. It was some kind of creature. Small, probably only a few feet tall, and green, entwined and trapped in what looked like an immense spider web at the river's edge below. No, not a web. Nets. Fishing nets. The river kept tugging the beast under the water before it would emerge again and scream. On either side were jagged rocks, churning up more white water, and every time the current pulled the poor thing under, the net stretched or tore, taking it closer to a braining against the stones. "What is it?" Aram shouted. "A murloc," she shouted back. "That's a murloc?" It wasn't at all what he'd pictured as a 6-year-old, searching Lake Everstill for signs of the devious monsters and his missing father. "I thought a murloc was more terrible." "They're terrible enough. Let's go." The creature's head emerged then above water and screamed plaintively. The words themselves were unintelligible, but Aram knew a cry for help when he heard one. "We can't leave it like that," he shouted. "We can. There's no way down here. Besides, murlocs can breathe underwater. The thing's in no danger of drowning. It's in danger of getting crushed on those rocks." And just then, the nets chucked the murloc against them. It cried out sharply in pain. "See!" Aram shouted, and then raced off, saying, "Come on! There was a way down back here!" Mikasa tried to grab him, but he was too fast and just out of her reach. Growling angrily, she followed him back to the crevasse. She overtook him there before he could start down. "No!" she yelled, grabbing hold of his shirt. Then something caught her eye. She turned. It was a stag. A massive buck, 10, 12 points at least. Only 10, 15 yards away with no cover in sight. Here was enough meat to feed them for weeks. She released Aram and turned to pull her harpoon out from between her back and her shield. But as she turned, Aram descended, wedging his arms on either side of the slim crevasse and lowering himself down a foot at a time. Mikasa felt helpless. She tried to keep an eye on the stag while calling back over her shoulder for Aram to stop. But the boy didn't stop. The deer tilted his head at her, staring her down, as if waiting for her to decide. Roaring louder than the river, she drove the harpoon down into dirt with both hands and turned her back on the animal. She could just hear him run off as she dropped onto her stomach and reached her long arm down, grabbing hold of Aram's hair, which was all she could reach. Ow! Let go! Listen! No, I have to try to save it. She didn't let go of his hair, but she swallowed hard. Fine, but first, give me the end of the rope. Or were you planning to fly back up here after your daring rescue of the slimy thing that's probably going to eat you? This gave him pause. He nodded and wedged his shoulders against one side of the crevasse and his feet against the other. Then he slowly reached for the rope that was wrapped around his torso. "Careful!" she barked, startling him. "Stop doing that," he said. He unknotted one end of the rope and handed it up to her. She finally let go of his hair, took the rope, and wrapped it around her hand a few times. "Now, unwind it." "We don't have time." He glanced down, but from this angle he could no longer see the murloc. "Do it or I'll rip out your scalp." Slowly, because slowly was the only way he could manage it in his current position, he did as he was told. As it slackened, Mikasa sat up and slung the rope around her back. "Now, tie the other end around your waist, and I'll lower you down." Now he understood, and quickly obeyed. He also tucked the compass under his shirt, as he'd seen his father do before taking action of any kind. He carefully rappelled down the crevasse, with an angry, grunting Mikasa acting as his anchor above. This was actually something he'd done before, at the Lakeshore Quarry back home with his friends Stitch and Willie, so he made good time to the bottom. Once his feet touched down on a thin strip of rocky terrain between the wall of the gorge and the rushing river, he waved up at Mikasa and untied the spent rope, leaving it hanging. Then he rushed upstream, hoping the murloc was still alive to save. Its screaming confirmed it was. Aram couldn't reach the creature, but he grabbed hold of the nets and tried to pull them in. But the panicked murloc hadn't yet seen its savior and was fighting the nets, and inadvertently fighting Aram. Aram pulled again, but the murloc and the current pulled back. He stumbled forward, his left leg sinking up to the knee in the rushing water. He looked down and couldn't see the river bottom. Aram was still off balance, and one more tug of the current submerged him completely. The water was dark and murky, cold and deep. It dragged him forward. He surfaced, gasping for breath and glimpsing the white water and rocks ahead. He fought the current, flashing back to the night he'd swum to shore and nearly drowned. And for one brief moment he thought, this time the water might win. But a hand grabbed his shoulder and pulled him back onto gravel. Aram sucked in air and looked up at a furious Mikasa looming over him. Now he flashed back to her yanking him out of his bunk aboard Wave Strider. Some things never change. She helped him, practically pulled him to his feet. They turned as the murloc, who seemed to be mostly one big head with gangly arms and legs, surfaced briefly and screamed again. But now the creature's large, soulful eyes locked onto Aram's. For the first time, the murloc became aware of his rescuer and smiled hopefully. Mikasa said, "If we're going to do this, let's do this." Together, they both grabbed hold of the nets and pulled with all their might. With Mikasa's strength added to his, the effort was more than enough. Nets and murloc came flying out of the water, slamming into Aram, who slammed into Mikasa. They all went down in a pile on the edge of the river. Mikasa, with Aram's armpit covering her eyes and a murloc foot stinking a fish right under her nose, growled, "Get off me." They scrambled off. The murloc, still tangled to some degree in the nets, bowed to his rescuers over and over. "Murky, he said, which meant exactly nothing to the two humans. Still, it was obvious the small green creature was grateful. He clapped his two-fingered hands and scampered about nervously back and forth on his webbed feet, tangling himself even more hopelessly. The fins on his cheeks flapped up and down. He seemed eager to approach Aram, but kept pulling back, afraid, or too wild and undomesticated to trust the human entirely. "You're welcome," Aram said. "Do you speak common?" "Murgle, nick, murky, murgle, murloc." "I guess you only speak Murloc." "Murgle, murgle, murgle," said the Murloc. "I'm Aram," the boy said, pointing to himself. Then he pointed to Mikasa. "This is Mikasa." The Murloc pointed to Aram and said, "Aram." Then he pointed to Mikasa and said, "Murksa." Finally, he pointed to himself and said, "Murky." "Murky? Your name is Murky?" "Murky, Murgle." "Wait, Murky or Murgle?" "Murky, Murky." "Murky. Got it." Murksa actually rolled her eyes. "Let's get out of here," she said. "Right," Aram said, turning to Murky. "Follow us. We have a way up and out, I think." Murky hesitated. He didn't seem to understand. Wasn't sure if he was wanted. "It'll be okay," Aram told him. He approached Murky slowly and then patted him on his slimy head. Murky seemed to like that and rubbed his head against Aram's stomach. It left behind an oily stain and the distinct aroma of old fish. Aram had to fight off the urge to vomit, even as he tried with little success to wipe his hand off on his pants. But the combination of Aram's soothing words and gentle actions had certainly worked its magic on the Murloc. Murky was nodding enthusiastically as he began to gather up his nets. Mikasa growled, "Are we really waiting for this thing?" Suddenly, Murky began jumping up and down excitedly. He reached down into his net and pulled out one very large salmon, then held it up over his head in triumph. Then, with much ceremony, he knelt in front of Aram and handed him the fish. Aram smiled up at Mikasa with his own bit of triumph. "Looks like we eat tonight." Chapter 18. Aram's Tale. Mikasa had left the rope tied to a rock atop the crevasse and used it to climb up. Then Aram followed, half climbing, half being pulled up by Mikasa. He turned to lower the rope back down to Murky, but the little Murloc had used his claws to scamper up the crevasse right behind Aram. So all three were back atop the gorge and exhausted. Night was falling. They found a copse of ironwood trees that hadn't yet been chopped down and made camp. Their fire was small and burned poorly. The wood was too green. But they were able to cook Murky salmon on a flat rock and share it among them. Murky initially declined his share, pantomiming that he wanted his rescuers to have it. Instead, he tried to eat the oilskin that had been wrapped around the box of flints. He said, trying to put a brave face on his feast. But ultimately, he spit it out at Aram's feet, shook his head, and said, "Look, Murky. Aram handed Murky a piece of fish, which the Murloc took, but made a face over. He used his claws to delicately remove any sign of charring before swallowing the remains down. Aram said, "You'd have liked it better raw, huh?" Murky smiled at him but said nothing. Aram was never entirely sure how much they understood each other. With 2 fingers, he reluctantly picked up the slimy, saliva-covered oilskin and laid it near the fire, hoping it would dry. And hoping he would dry too. His plunge into the river had soaked him to the bone, and the night was getting cold. He huddled as close to the fire as he could get without setting himself ablaze, and as he stared, he thought of Wavestrider aflame, and his face darkened. It was then that Murky tried to get his attention, calling out, "Urm! Urm!" It took Aram some time to realize Murky was trying to say his name, and thus a lesson in pronunciation began. Urm. Aram. Urm. No. Aram. Urm. Close enough, Aram said. So you can understand common? Said Murky, nodding. You're nodding, so Murgle means yes, right? The Murloc shrugged ambivalently. Aram sighed. But Murky wasn't finished. He began talking rapidly. Aram smiled and shook his head. I'm sorry, I don't understand. So Murky began to act out his tale. He picked up his nets and started walking in place. Aram attempted to follow along. You took your nets and went for a walk. Mikasa stared at them both, unsure which one was crazier. Murky then began throwing out his nets. You went fishing. Murky clapped his hands together. Then he climbed into his nets and intentionally tangled himself up in them. You got tangled in your nets. And that's when we found you. Murky's face fell. He shook his head, waved his arm back behind him, and said, Look! Look! Then, still completely tangled in his nets, he started clomping halfway round the campfire and growling, Mikasa had to leap forward to keep him from dragging the nets through the fire itself. Stop! She shouted at him. He clapped his hands, pointed at her, and shouted back, Suddenly, he threw his arms around himself and wrestled himself to the ground. Then he looked up at Aram and said, Sorry, Aram said. You lost me. Murky frowned and looked at Mikasa. Don't look at me, she said. I wasn't even paying attention to you, Murloc. Aram turned to her with a reprimand. Why not? He taught us both to pay attention to everything. To everyone. They both knew exactly whom Aram meant by he. Aram saw Mikasa look down, actually chastened. A girl again. Murky was now trying to disentangle himself from his nets. With little luck. Aram stood and went to his aid. The Murloc seemed to appreciate the help, but seemed equally determined to help Aram help him. He wouldn't keep still, and Aram wasn't having any better luck setting him free. Wait, Murky, don't move. I've almost got it. Finally, a frustrated Mikasa told Aram, Out of the way. She grabbed the nets and lifted them up to her full height. Murky hung there by one last tangled foot. Aram rushed in and pulled the foot loose. Murky dropped, landing on his head. Aram knelt down, apologizing. Mikasa swung the nets clear of Murloc, boy, and fire. Then she sat back down in a huff. Aram was concerned the Murloc had been hurt, but Murky seemed cheerful. He pointed at what remained of the fish. Nothing but bones, the head, and bits of skin. Be my guest, Aram said. Murky scooped up the remains and practically inhaled them, bones and all. Aram was half prepared to see the Murloc spit it all out as he had the oilskin, but Murky swallowed, smiled, and lay down on his stomach with a contented sigh. He propped his head up and stared at Aram with the biggest puppy-dog frog eyes the boy had ever seen. I think he's in love, said Mikasa ruefully. He's just grateful, Aram shot back. Murky made Aram smile, and he pulled out his sketchbook to capture the Murloc and that feeling. He flipped past the unfinished memory sketch of his father, pausing over it before shaking his head and turning the leaf to a blank page. While Murky tended to his nets, rolling them up into a thick belt that he tied around his small waist so that the belt became something more like a vest by the time he was done, Aram began sketching the Murloc in detail. The huge head and eyes, the cheek fins, tiny nostril holes, and crooked, toothy smile. The little body, so small it barely seemed capable of supporting the weight of Murky's head, and the musculature that actually did make it capable. As usual, sketching brought Aram closer to his subject, showed him the biology they had in common. Aram's own smile began to mimic Murky's as he started another sketch, this one showing the Murloc in a familiar pose, entangled in his nets. Murky said, resting what passed for his chin on one hand. Then he pointed at Aram and said, He pointed at the nets in himself. Then he pointed at Aram again. Aram had a sudden epiphany. You want to know my story? Murky said, and shrugged again. Suddenly, Aram was less certain of his epiphany. And besides, which story is that? On his last morning in Lakeshire, Aramar Thorn had risen early, determined to go nowhere. But his parents, all three of them, had made their own determinations. Saya, Rob, and Grayton were all waiting for him by the fire, and Aram could instantly tell by their expressions, different as they all were, that his cause was already lost. Not that Aram was ready to accept that loss, or at any rate, not that he was going to make it easy on any of them. Yes, there might have been a part of him that was curious, excited even, to travel with Graydon. Truthfully, he had dreamed of following, or perhaps chasing, his father to sea for years. But he hated that he was being given no choice in the matter now. So he suppressed that part of himself and argued, debated, whined, wheedled, pled, and flat-out refused. Graydon largely stayed out of the discussion, but it hardly mattered. Saya and Rob were adamant that Aram needed time to get to know his father, to understand him, and to see the world. Aram appealed to their practicality, to their emotions, to their sense of justice. He wouldn't even shy away from questioning their concern for him, or from claiming they'd always wanted to get rid of him, so that they could have their own little family without any reminders of Saya's old life with Graydon. If it seemed helpful to his cause, he said it. If it seemed hurtful, but helpful to his cause, he said it anyway. Saya had tears in her eyes, but it changed nothing. She said, Aram, I know you're angry and frightened. I'm not frightened, he had said. Yes, you are. We're asking you, telling you to leave everything you've ever known. Who wouldn't be frightened? He glowered, but said nothing. But this is something you need to do, or you will always wonder. You need to go out and explore that piece of you that is just like Graydon Thorn. I'm nothing like him. Oh, Aram, you grow more and more like him every day. If I thought you could see that, I might let you stay. Fine, I see it. She smiled then through her tears. Nice try, clever boy. But you need to open your heart to him again. I know he hurt you, hurt us. But you need to know him, to know yourself. And you need to see all of Azeroth. Open yourself to its strangers and their customs before you can decide that Lakeshire is truly your home. And you need, she trailed off. Need what? The rest you need to discover with time. How much time? A year. After that, if you want to come home, I don't want to leave, so of course I'll want to come home. After a year, you can come home. So there had been a little packing, and a lot of goodbyes. Robertson seemed as angry as Aram, and actually threw a cup at Graydon's head over breakfast, which, if it accomplished nothing else, at least made Aram smile. After that, Graydon waited outside. Celia was inconsolable, and the more she cried, the more their mother cried. Soot began to howl. Rob Glade finally picked up Aram's rucksack and walked the boy out. Graydon, trying not to look too pleased, stood at the crossroads a dozen yards away. Rob knelt beside Aram and busied himself squaring Aram's sweater on his shoulders. Don't spend the next year being stubborn, he said, or angry, or bitter, or any of those things. Any son of mine knows better than to starve his own fire that way. The forge needs to be fed to stay hot enough to melt iron, hot enough to make something strong. So make yourself into something strong by feeding your forge with everything you can. Understand? No, Aram said gloomily, though he thought he probably did. All right, you can starve it for one day. I don't blame you, I suppose. But by sunrise tomorrow, you open your eyes and feed that fire, Aram. The big man was squeezing back tears. He cuffed the boy gently, though not too gently, then stood abruptly, went inside, and shut the door, leaving Aramar Thorn alone with his new captain. Aram stared at Murky and sketched the gigantic pupils of his big eyes onto the page. Murky prompted. You want my story? Aram glanced at Mikasa, who was watching him intently. Finally he said, Mikasa and I were on a ship. Pirates attacked. Everyone died. We escaped. That's my story. Murky seemed unsatisfied. Even Mikasa seemed unsatisfied. But that, Aram decided, was all Urim had to say tonight. After finishing the sketch, he closed the book, turned over, and tried to sleep. Watching with glowing silver eyes, the stag heard all of this. His curiosity piqued. But the scorpid had witnessed none of it. As soon as Skitter had spotted Aram and the others sitting around the campfire, she had turned right around to fetch Zathra and the rest of the hidden. Chapter 19. Points. Come the morning, Mikasa seemed in a better humor. She graciously thanked Murky for the salmon and wished him well before saying goodbye. Murky looked stricken. Look, Murky, Aram smiled. I think he wants to come with us. What? No, absolutely not. Why? I've enough trouble looking after your sorry rear. We don't need another mouth to feed, especially one we can't even understand. I'm starting to understand him a bit. That's not the point, she growled. Well, what is the point? The point? The point, she was shouting, which was bad enough. But then her voice lowered to a whisper, which for Aram was somehow even worse. The point is Captain Thorn is dead. Our entire crew is dead. These lands are crawling with ogres, blasted snakes, and nothing to eat. You and I are lost and probably doomed. And so the life debt I still owe to your father will forever owe to him. Even though he's gone, grows more difficult to guarantee with every passing minute. I can't take it, Aram. I can't take on one more responsibility. I swear I'm at my limit. That's the point. She blinked back tears. The point is, Graydon had said, home isn't a place. It's the people with whom you choose to share your life. Family is what makes a home, not the other way around. And there are all kinds of families. Aram did something odd then. Something spontaneous and honest, but bizarre to anyone who had known him and Mikasa, or had ever seen them together. He embraced her. He wrapped his arms around her. Chain, harpoon, shield, and all. And hugged her tight. She stiffened, and her own arms hung at her sides at first. But gradually she raised them and hugged him back. She laid her cheek atop his head and exhaled something suspiciously like a sigh. He thought we both loved him, and her thoughts mirrored his. There was no need to say the words aloud. For once, each just knew what the other was thinking. They were brother and sister, mourning the same father. Both had their eyes closed and were quiet. Murky hugged them both around the legs, breaking the spell. Mikasa instantly pulled away, wiping her bare arm across her eyes. Aram wiped his eyes with his dirty sleeve. He shrugged and smiled at her. She scowled and turned away, but her next words were, "Fine, he can tag along, but he's your responsibility, Aram." "Sure, Murksa." Murky skipped in place. "Murksa, Aram." Mikasa Flintwill shook her head, but Aram could tell she was at least a little bit amused. She marched on. They followed. At home, Aram had a sister, a little sister, and a little brother. But he knew now that Mikasa had truly become his big sister. Family. It had probably been true for months, though the realization was fresh. He hadn't recognized it, because he had always been the oldest of his siblings, the one who took care of and watched over, and yes, on occasion teased, the younglings. But that was Mikasa's job with him. He knew how she felt. His stewardship of Robertson and Celia had never been quite so dire, but there had been times, like on trips to the quarry, when trying to keep an eye on both had nearly driven him mad. He caught up to Mikasa and asked, "Do you have any brothers or sisters?" "Why?" she asked suspiciously without slowing down. Ignoring the question, he instead volunteered, "I have one younger brother, Robertson, and a baby sister, Celia." "I have 3 older brothers," she said, "a Dashe, a Kashinga, and a Male." So that's it, he thought. I'm not used to being the youngest, and she's not used to being the eldest. No wonder we're always tearing at each other. "Had," she said quietly. "What?" "Had 3 brothers. They're gone now. Dead. All of them. I'd be with them too, if not for your father." She risked a glance at him. He swallowed, too stunned, thankfully, to offer up a look of pity, which would have truly set her off. Murky came up on the other side, saying, "Murky, Murksa." She stared at him, then offered up an unsure, "Thank you?" The Murloc nodded, satisfied. Aram was staring at the ground as they walked, 3 abreast in silence. He knew he had led a sheltered life. The attack on Wavestrider was literally the worst thing that had ever happened to him. The only other thing that even registered on the scale was Graydon's desertion. And those 2 things were bad enough for any child's lifetime. But he had been so self-centered, it had never even occurred to him to consider Mikasa's story and what she had been through. She had the same tragedy of the Wavestrider to equal his, because hadn't Graydon been as much her father aboard that ship as Aram's, and she had an entire past Aram knew nothing at all about. Nothing except this. She had had 3 older brothers, who were all now dead. He said, "Do you want to?" "No," she said fiercely. But then she added more softly, "Not now." So they walked on, following the gorge and the river, across the ravaged land of tree stumps and seared grass. Late that afternoon, Murky proved his worth to Aram, and even a little bit to Mikasa, by leading them down a steep but walkable path to the river to drink. They had skipped breakfast and lunch, so Mikasa broke out the very last of the hardtack, reluctantly sharing it with Murky. "That's it," she said. "No more." Murky started to unfold his nets from around his waist. Both Aram and Mikasa considered this sensible. Another fish dinner would do nicely. But 12 seconds later, Murky had hopelessly tangled himself in the mesh again. While trying to negotiate his freedom, twisting the net over, sliding it under, and pulling this limb free of that loop, tugging that limb free of this loop, Murky suddenly screamed. Aram thought at first that the Murloc was in pain, but as soon as he could get a hand free, Murky pointed up to the top of the gorge, shouting, "Rrrr, rrrr." They looked, but saw nothing. Murky growled in frustration and reached for Mikasa's cutlass. She slapped his hand away. "Don't touch!" "Murksa! Mrrrr!" He swung an imaginary sword around. Murksa! Mrugul! He then pointed at Aram's cutlass and said, Urum! Mrugul! They both got the message and drew their swords. What did he see? Aram asked. I don't know, Mikasa said, scanning the cliffside, but I trust it scared him. Stay on guard. She glanced back at Murky. And get him out of that net, or we're leaving him behind for whatever's out there. We're not leaving him behind when he's the one who warned us, Aram said, knowing she had no real intention of leaving anyone behind. She did, however, seem to be all right with the idea of cutting him free of the net. This also made Murky scream in horror. Look! Look! Murky! Murky! Look! Murloc!
A Murloc must always protect his nets,
said a booming voice behind them. Mikasa and Aram both wheeled about. A tall figure in dark hooded robes was standing behind them, close enough to make Mikasa curse herself under her breath for allowing the stranger to draw so near. The newcomer's face was hidden by his hood, instantly reminding Aram of the Whisper Man. But this clearly wasn't him. If the hood was any indication, this stranger had a preposterously wide head, and although he stooped, bent nearly halfway over and leaning on a walking stick, he was still taller than Mikasa by at least half a foot.
Have no fear,
he said.
I mean no harm.
He spoke softly, but this was no Whisper Man. His voice was fuller, warmer. It was a still tangled Murky who whispered, Kulturi, while bowing very low. Aram didn't understand, but Mikasa hadn't put up her sword, so Aram kept his out and at the ready. Mikasa said, Druid. And now Aram understood. He felt his throat go dry, and was suddenly very conscious of trying to swallow. This, as Graydon had taught him, was a Kaldorai, a night elf, a druid, a shapeshifter. As if confirming Aram's unspoken thoughts, the stranger reached up to lower his hood. Slowly, Mikasa demanded.
Of course,
said the druid, complying. The hood came down, revealing a thin and ancient face with lined indigo skin, long hair the color of ice, tucked behind pointed ears, glowing silver eyes that reflected the starlight, and massive brown antlers. 10, 12 points at least, murmured Mikasa. Then, at full volume, You're the stag, aren't you?
Guilty, I am afraid.
There was a smile audible in the druid's voice to match the visible one on his face. You've been watching us? It wasn't a question.
Guilty again.
He still seemed mildly amused by the interrogation. Following us?
Well, hold on now, young lady. Mostly I was just heading in the same direction. But keeping an eye on you made the journey more diverting.
I nearly had you for dinner, Mikasa said grimly.
You nearly tried, yes? No hard feelings.
Aram was too busy staring to say anything. Those glowing silver eyes were disconcerting at first, but within seconds they radiated an infectious calm.
The Kaldorai are a sight to behold, surely,
Graydon had said.
Merely laying eyes on one can take the most hardened warrior's breath away, and that is something they count on. You may not see it, but you'll feel it. They have an aura, power. It surrounds and infuses them. It's blasted irresistible. But resist you must. A night elf can be a great friend, or a terrible foe. I can't say you'll ever meet one in the flesh, son, but if you do, find out which you're facing before you lower your guard.
Aram struggled to follow his father's advice. Then the night elf smiled again and, raising an eyebrow, said,
My name is Thalis Greyoak. And you are?
And just like that, words poured forth unbidden from Aram's mouth before he had the thought to form, let alone censor them. I'm Aram Thorn, but you can call me Aram. Mikasa scowled at him. He shrugged sheepishly, but babbled on. This is Mikasa Flintwill, and this is Murky.
It is a pleasure to meet you all, and it would be nice to have some company for a time.
Our party, Mikasa growled, is already larger than originally planned.
So, one more should not matter, especially one more with a pack full of food he is willing to share.
Mikasa and Aram exchanged a telling glance, and Thalis's eyes twinkled with pleasure.
The sun is setting, and I have been this way before. I know a good place to make camp for the night, and if you follow me, it will be easier to keep your eyes sharp and your swords leveled at my back.
The druid chuckled then, and walked with casual impunity right between Aram and Mikasa. Without stopping, he gave a short tug on one end of the nets, and Murky rolled scot-free. Murky promptly scooped up the nets and scrambled after the night elf, saying, Aram looked to Mikasa. She nodded with some reluctance, and they followed. But Aram saw that her cutlass remained in her hand and at the ready. She didn't trust the idea that the night elf just happened to be going their way. Mikasa's memory was long, but it required no long memory to recall that the pirate captain had a troll, an ogre, and one of the Forsaken under his command. Why not a druid as well? Chapter 20. Friends around the campfire. They sat around the campfire, while Thalis prepared a stew of wild carrots and snap peas and potatoes and spices that the night elf had produced by emptying his pack.
No venison,
the druid had said, with a wink at Mikasa. As he stirred the stew, Thalis spoke of gathering each of the vegetables, carefully and in turn, so that more would grow.
That, of course, is my function as a druid. I do what I can to protect the wild.
Aram was instantly fascinated. Like the birds and the beasts?
Well, my specialty is flora, not fauna. But yes, we so-called sentient species do an incredible amount of quite insentient violence to the natural order. Druids try to balance that with restoration, recovery, and care.
Magic, Mikasa grumbled darkly.
When a flower blooms, is that not magical? When a lamb is born to a ewe, are mysteries not revealed? Yes, I am a magic user of a kind, but trust me, my magics are of the natural order. Certainly when compared to the forged axe that has so unnaturally cut down nearly every tree in these parts.
Thalis only had one small stew pot and one large spoon, so they took turns passing the concoction around atop a folded strip of blanket to save their hands, if not always their tongues, from being burnt. When divided by 4, the quantity fell short of a feast, but the fare was warm and rich and zesty. Murky seemed quite impressed with the spices, and he poured the remaining contents of the spice vial down his gullet. Instantly, his eyes bugged out, even more than usual. He spat out so much slimy saliva he nearly put out the fire. Fortunately, the Kaldorei seemed prepared for this and whipped the stew pot and its precious contents out of harm's way. Murky ran to the river and completely submerged his head for several minutes. Finally, he came back, dripping and drooling and apologizing.
Murky murgle kulduri. Call me Thalis. Plus. Thalis. Plus. No. Thalis. Tolos. Tolos. Close enough, Thalis said.
Hello, Dulles, Aram said with a smile. I'm Urim. This is Murksa. Dulles, Urim, Murksa, Murky, Murky said, clapping his hands together and smiling gleefully. Dulles, Urim, Murksa, Murky, Murglums. Murgle, Murglums, Thalos said, nodding. Mikasa and Aram both sat up, saying in virtual unison, You speak Murloc?
Of course. You do not?
No, said Mikasa, glowering. Aram just shook his head.
Oh, it is a wonderful language. True, it can be very difficult to get one's tongue around the subtleties of pronunciation, but well worth the effort. It is so beautifully expressive. Would you not agree?
It's gibberish, Mikasa stated. Thalos raised a slim white eyebrow.
As is every language to those who know it not, correct?
Aram was getting drowsy, but he fought it, intrigued. What did he say? Thalos asked. Before, Aram replied. He said our names and something else, and you agreed.
Oh, yes. He called us all friends. Murglums. Friends.
Murglums, Murky parroted. Friends. Friends, Aram corrected. Friends. 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 Close enough. Murky grinned broadly, and Aram did too. Thalos twinkled considerably. Murky prompted Aram. Murky, friends, Murglums. Aram said, Aram, Murky, Murglums. Murky scrunched up his face. Thalos said,
You just called the two of you ringworms.
I did? Say it again, please.
Murglums.
Murglums. Murky laughed and shook his head. Friends, friends, friends.
He has given up. He says, Franz is good enough.
What did I say this time?
Tasty ringworms.
Ugh.
Indeed.
Aram pulled out his sketchbook. Instantly, Mikasa said, You better not be putting me in that blasted book. Aram said, I promise I won't sketch you unless you ask me to. But for the first time, he wished she would ask him to. Instead, he swallowed, turned to the night elf, and asked, Do you mind?
Not at all,
said Thalos, striking an intentionally comic, noble pose.
Which is my best side?
Murky came around behind Aram to watch him draw. What? The Murloc said. What did he say? Aram asked.
Good magic,
said Thalos nonchalantly.
He means you're drawing.
Aram felt his heart sink. He tried to focus on capturing Thalos's likeness, but it was suddenly hard to concentrate. He had to get back to redrawing his father. He felt it strongly now, as if Graydon Thorne's life depended on it. Graydon Thorne, who's probably already dead. That's what Mikasa said. He's dead, except we don't know for sure. And as long as we don't know, then maybe he is alive. And maybe good magic can make the difference. He ceased drawing the elf mid-line and flipped back a couple pages to the failed, incomplete memory sketch of his father. He struggled with it, drawing lines, rubbing them out. It was no use. Drawing from memory was always difficult enough, but he could almost physically feel Graydon's visage withdrawing from his mind, growing distant and indistinct. He turned back to the drawing of Thalos, wanting to finish something, anything. And wanting to change the subject of his own mental discussion, he asked, The other night, Murky tried to tell us a story, but we couldn't understand. Murky, still behind him, began hopping up and down. This made Mikasa uncomfortable for some reason, and she shifted on the dirt, her hand unconsciously straying to her harpoon. Thalos asked,
Murky?
The little Murloc came around to the campfire and gathered up his nets. Mikasa and Aram both reached out to stop him. Whoa, wait, Aram said. Have him tell the story without the nets. We don't need to untangle him again." Thalus, as usual, seemed amused. He scratched one pointed ear and said,
Murky.
"Murg, nuk, mgrr." Murky looked briefly disappointed, but he shrugged it off. Slowly, he mimed picking up the nets as the druid translated the Murloc's narration.
He says he is from a fishing village on the Forgotten Coast. Lived there with an uncle and aunt, or maybe older cousins.
Murky clarified,
Yes, I was right. Uncle and aunt.
They continued.
He left one day to go fishing, but his return was delayed.
"Let me guess," Mikasa said. "He tangled himself in his nets."
Yes, said Thalus. It seems to be a common occurrence with the little fellow.
Mikasa shook her head and muttered, "The uselessness of this creature is truly astonishing." Aram shushed her. He was still drawing Thalus, glancing back and forth from the elf to the Murloc, who seemed to take no notice of Mikasa's contempt and was still performing for his audience.
When he returned to the village, everyone was gone. His uncle, his aunt, all his friends and family. Gone.
"What happened?" Aram asked. He was no longer drowsy, sitting forward on his knees. Murky began stomping around the campfire, saying, and half a second before the Kaldori translated, Aram finally understood. "Ogres," Thalus and Aram said in unison. Mikasa's scowl vanished. She and Aram exchanged a glance, as both thought of the ogre Throg, who had cut down so many of their crew before crippling the ship by cutting down Wave Strider's mainmast.
It was an entire ogre clan. He calls it Grundiclun Ogres,
Murky repeated, before ranting angrily and rapidly, spittle flying as he spoke.
I think he means the Gordoni clan of ogres. He says he says something rather impolite about them, actually. But the gist is they have been raiding the coastline for years, taking Murlocs and others, but they had never taken an entire village before.
"What do they do with their captives?" Aram asked. "Did he find any bodies?" Mikasa demanded. Thalus and Aram stared at her. The latter knew she wasn't one to mince words, but he thought that was fairly insensitive even for her. But Murky didn't seem troubled by it. He simply shrugged. He went on, and the druid did too.
No bodies, no sign of his people at all. The ogres always disappear back into the mountains with their prey. It has been a month since the raid, and Murky has not seen anyone from his village since.
Mikasa stood. "How often were these raids?" Thalus looked to Murky, who muttered, Thalus asked, trying to clarify. Thalus scrunched his brow and thought. He said,
Murlocs do not mark time the way we do, so his answer is, shall we say, vague. If I were to guess, I would say the raids came every couple of months.
"Every couple of months along the coast?" asked Mikasa.
Yes.
"Then raiding parties here in the low hills, closer to the ogres' mountains, could come more frequently. We need to maintain a watch." "He did try to tell us last night," Aram said. She nodded. "I suppose he did." Thalus rose and stretched.
"I will take the first watch. I do not mind."
Mikasa stared the night elf down. Finally, she said, "No, I'm awake now. You rest." The druid smiled and shrugged, and said to Aram,
"I do not believe I have quite earned the trust of your friend."
He had made no attempt to lower his voice, so Aram didn't either. Given what we've been through, she has good cause to be cautious.
"And you do not?"
"I do." He looked at Mikasa. They nodded at each other. "But I have her to watch my back."
"And do you not watch hers?"
"Yes, but she's much better at it." "He's learning," Mikasa said. which was just about the closest thing to praise he'd ever received from Wavestrider's second mate. "All of you can rest. I have the watch." Aram pocketed his sketchbook and pencil. Murky curled up by the fire. Thalis, still smiling, addressed Mikasa.
"You keep your watch. I shall keep mine. I do not sleep on beautiful nights such as this. In fact, I have not slept on any night in the wild for over 9,000 years."
Aram gulped. 9,000 years?
9,013, to be precise. There was one drunken night near Sky Peak, or else it would easily be 10,000.
Murky was already snoring, but Aram's eyes widened in stunned amazement as Thalis began to transform before him and Mikasa. Only his antlers and his silver eyes remained the same. He bent fully over as his robes glowed briefly, then vanished, and his arms became forelegs, and his hands and feet hooves. His ice-colored hair actually shortened, turning into ice-colored fur, which grew rapidly, progressing down over his entire frame, now covered with strange, rune-like markings. Last of all, his face stretched into the snout of a great stag. With jaws hanging slack, Aram and Mikasa watched the beast leap away, following his swift progress under the light of a nearly full moon, until finally the stag, the Kaldorei, vanished into the dark night. Chapter 21. Magics of Druids. Mikasa roused Aram with considerably more gentleness than she had ever done aboard Wavestrider. She whispered, "Draw your cutlass. Take the watch. It'll be morning in a couple of hours. If the elf comes back before then, wake me. If you see or hear anything besides that murloc snoring, wake me." He nodded. She nodded back. "Keep your eyes and ears open," she said. Then, after laying down her harpoon and sword within easy reach on either side of her, she turned her back to the dying fire, laid her head on her shield, and closed her eyes. As ordered, Aram stood and drew his sword. He flapped his arms about for warmth. Padding softly, he circled the campfire a few hundred times, and he stayed on the alert. Finally, the first glimmer of light appeared in the east, heralding sunrise. That same sun would already be up in Lakeshore. By now, Rob was feeding the forge, and Saya was preparing breakfast, maybe sending Soot to wake Robertson and Celia. Mikasa slept on. Aram had never known her to sleep past dawn. He wondered if this slumber was an indication she felt secure under his watch, an indication she was beginning to trust him more. He decided it was more likely an indication she was exhausted. As he regarded her, something nudged his shoulder from behind. He was so startled he nearly jumped into the cold fire pit. But when he turned to look, it was the stag. The stag with something in his mouth. Aram, sword still out, approached with caution. It was a book. It was... Aram slapped his back pocket, but his sketchbook wasn't there. The huge, blasted beast had approached in what was nearly broad daylight and picked Aram's pocket while he had stood there, staring at Mikasa. The stag reached his head forward. Aram carefully took the sketchbook with his free hand. Then the stag struck an intentionally comic, noble pose. Aram glanced back at Mikasa. She had told him to wake her if the elf came back before morning. But strictly speaking, it was already morning, and this was the stag, not the elf. Plus, Mikasa was clearly so tired. Murky, crunching on a fresh carrot, finally woke Mikasa. Though Thalis had reverted to his two-legged form, Aram was putting the finishing touches on his sketch of the stag. Mikasa was silently furious, glaring reproachful daggers that clearly spoke, "I trusted you." He felt ashamed. He had betrayed her trust, and just for the artistic satisfaction of drawing the shapeshifter as a buck. His eyes expressed his regret, but she wasn't ready to forgive him, or herself. The druid handed Aram a carrot. Then he reached out with one for Mikasa. She waved it off. He said,
Be angry if you must, but do not be foolishly stubborn. You need sustenance.
Aram found himself saying, You need to feed your forge. She turned her back on him, but took the carrot. The night elf then reached into his pack. It seemed empty, or nearly so. He pulled out one last carrot and snapped off the tip in his mouth. Crunching away, he said,
Where are you headed? I am en route to Gadgetzan myself.
Aram said, So are we, before Mikasa could stop him.
Well then, Thalis said, suppose we make up a party.
Mikasa glowered, but it was hard to take her seriously while she munched on the carrot. Aram shrugged at her. Safety in numbers? She said nothing, which was as close to an acquiescence as Aram thought they were likely to get. Murky said, Murky nook, murkurum mga, murky magamurkur, front. Thalis translated.
He says he has nowhere to go, so he will travel with his good friends.
Fine, Mikasa said coldly. She took another bite. They broke camp. Hiking out of the gorge in single file, with Thalis leading, followed by Murky, Aram, and Mikasa, they reached the ridge, which began to turn southeast again. To confirm this, Aram pulled the compass out from beneath his shirt. Sure enough, their path and the needle were now pointing in the same direction. So either the device was truly sending Aram home, or it was just permanently broken. Aram preferred to believe the former. He tucked it back in under his shirt and looked up. His eyes met Thalis's, who was looking back over his shoulder, studying the boy. The night elf's tongue snuck out and tapped his upper lip twice. Then Thalis nodded to himself and turned away. Dark clouds gathered above them, and the troll watched them from below.
Why do we wait?
Demanded Sarbeak.
We wait for confirmation,
rumbled Malice. You have it, Mon, Zathra said, joining them in the clearing. The human boy has the compass round his neck.
There,
said Sarbeak.
You have your answer. What new excuse will you use to delay us?
Malice ignored the Arakoa.
Who's with him, Zathra? Be specific.
It be as Throg said. There be the tall, dark-skinned human girl from Thorn's ship.
A good fighter, that one,
whispered Valdred cheerfully.
And the puny Murloc. Is he still with them?
Asked the ogre, while fastening a pipe to his wrist.
Yeah, brother. The boy seems particularly fond of the creature.
The troll stroked her armor.
Be treating him like a pet.
Interesting,
Malice said, stroking his chin.
And they be with a night elf, a druid. They gather allies as they go.
Sarbeak hissed furiously.
Our position weakens while you waste time.
Malice still ignored him.
A shifter, then?
Yeah, mon, she confirmed.
The stag?
Asked Throg, who had earlier taken his own turn observing them.
Yeah, brother. One and the same.
And what other magics does this elf possess?
Malice said.
None that I seen, but...
She let the implications hang.
Fear not the magics of druids. There is nothing a night elf may summon that I cannot counter, but the compass.
Finally, Malice turned to the Arakoa.
The compass will be ours, sorcerer.
And this is how. The day waned. For the most part, their path sloped upward, sometimes steeply. Thalis was very sure of foot, and Murky's webbed, clawed feet seemed to suck onto the rocky terrain and pop free with each step. Mikasa also seemed to have no difficulties, but Aram was a bit less sound. He nearly stumbled once. a bit too close to the edge of the river gorge, which was now a good 100 feet deep at least. But Mikasa steadied him. Though she hadn't quite forgiven him yet, she was still his big sister and protector. Aram knew those things weren't mutually exclusive. Thalos had an actual canteen, and he shared its contents with the others. Mikasa seemed reluctant. Aram wondered if her hesitancy was because she feared the druid had put something in the water. But he ultimately came to the conclusion that Mikasa simply didn't like being beholden to, well, anyone, especially not a stranger. For his part, however, Aram was glad for Thalos's company. Murky's too, for that matter. Both were considerably more talkative than Mikasa and made the long walk less of a chore. Of course, Aram knew the conversation was another source of irritation for Mikasa. More than once, she had told them to hold it down, concerned they were making themselves targets for any nearby marauding ogre clans. But they were already in plain sight, walking along the ridgeline. If the Gorduni ogres were searching for targets, the four travelers weren't exactly hard to find. It was probably for this reason that Mikasa had given up trying to silence her companions, but that had done little to quell her annoyance. Thalos did most of the talking, either on his own initiative or by translating for a similarly chatty Murky. Thalos pointed out lichens and moss and elucidated which were healthful and which were mildly or thoroughly poisonous. His sharp gray eyes picked out raptors at some distance. He spoke of their nesting and hunting habits. Aram thought that Charnas of Gadgetzan would enjoy conversing with Thalos. For that matter, so would Graydon Thorn. Like Aram's father, the Night Elf was interested in everything and everyone. He even attempted to get Mikasa to talk, to tell her story. He met with no success at all, but that hardly damaged his cheerful mien. With Aram, the Night Elf had better luck. Aram talked of Lakeshire and the forge, of his brother and sister and dog, of his mother and stepfather. As much as possible, he avoided speaking of Graydon, or the ship, of the attack and their reason for being stranded as they were in Feralis. But Thalos didn't press those points, and seemed perfectly satisfied hearing about the flora and fauna surrounding Lake Everstill, or the fish Murky's uncle netted along the Forgotten Coast. It occurred to Aram that despite the quantity of verbiage constantly emerging from the Kaldorai's mouth, Thalos actually revealed almost nothing about himself. If Aram were inclined to suspicion as Mikasa was, almost for her sake, he asked, "What is your business in Gadgetzan?"
There is a druid tender there, an old friend, part of the Cenarian Circle. I need to consult with her on druidic matters. Oh, and I have a gift for her as well. Just a little thing, but I think she will be quite pleased.
"You sound like you're going courting," Aram said. Thalos laughed.
Oh, she is a few centuries too young for me, I would wager. Though I would not mind.
He seemed to get lost in such thoughts for a moment, and Aram briefly found himself thinking of the lost Duan Fen. But the Night Elf soon laughed himself out of his musings. He said,
"And what awaits you and Mikasa in Gadgetzan, my young friend?"
"Hopefully a ship to the Eastern Kingdoms. A ship home." Thalos turned back to look at Mikasa and asked,
"Do you make your home in the East too?"
She said nothing at first. For some reason, Aram thought it likely that the Night Elf already knew she was from Booty Bay in the Eastern Kingdoms. Finally, Mikasa said, "My home is aboard Wavestrider. Once the boy is safe, I will return to it." Thalos raised an eyebrow.
"Even if she is at the bottom of the sea?"
"Even if," she said, without hesitation. Aram looked back at her. She met his glance. "Even if," she repeated quietly. Thalos stopped, so Murky stopped, and Aram, who was still looking back over his shoulder at Mikasa, tripped over the Murloc, landing painfully, shoulder against rock. Murky said, "I'm fine," Aram said, chagrined. The others watched him lurch to his feet, rubbing his shoulder. Thalos said,
"There is a switchback trail here, back down to the river."
He held out a hand. It was starting to drizzle.
"There is even some cover below, a ledge which could come in handy with a storm brewing.
And if the river floods? Asked Mikasa.
Oh, well, in that case, we would all drown. Except Murky, I suppose. But we are almost out of water, and there is no cover up here at all. Not from rain or ogres.
Mikasa lowered her head in defeat. She was losing control, had lost command of their travels. She couldn't fault the Night Elf's logic, but Aram knew she didn't like depending on it. They all followed Thalos down the trail. It was treacherous. The more so as the rain began to make the rocky path slick. Aram's shoulder ached, as did his feet, his calves, and even his head. If and when he did get back to Lakeshore, he'd sleep for a fortnight. Finally, they reached the bottom and made camp against the wall of the gorge, beneath the ledge of rock Thalos had promised. There was no wood for a fire, and no food, but at least the river enabled them to slake their thirst. After drinking his fill, Murky pulled out his nets and said, Thalos said,
He is offering to use his nets to fish for our supper.
No! Mikasa and Aram said at once. Murky's shoulders sank. Mikasa hefted her harpoon. I'll try to hunt. Though given that the ogres have all but left this place a barren wasteland, I don't hold out much hope.
That is quite unnecessary, Thalos said. I will procure our meal.
Aram tilted his head to regard the Night Elf. You don't mean to say you still have supplies in your pack after last night?
No, it is quite empty. Even my spices were spent,
he said with a glance at Murky. Murky sank a bit more and muttered,
No worries, little friend. I can find us all the food we might need.
Mikasa eyed the old druid. What part of barren wasteland did you not understand? The Kaldori laughed.
Care to make a wager on who brings home dinner?
I don't gamble, she replied flatly. He laughed again.
Of course not.
So Mikasa departed upriver to hunt, and Thalos downriver to gather, leaving Murky and Aram alone. Aram said, I suppose it would help if we looked for firewood. You go upstream, I'll go downstream. Murky nodded enthusiastically, happy to be of some service. They split up. Aram headed downriver. The light rain had stopped for the moment. As the minutes passed, he expected to catch up to Thalos pulling fungus off a rock. Instead, he spotted the Night Elf sitting cross-legged in front of a patch of damp soil. Aram started to speak, but something held him back. He didn't approach. He watched. The druid reached a hand into his pack and pulled out a small brown leather pouch. He carefully poured something out of the pouch and into his open palm. Then he tilted his hand over the soil. Aram realized the pouch had been full of seeds, as Thalos pushed one after another into the dirt with a finger and then covered the small holes with soil. The druid reached into an inner pocket of his robe and drew out another leather pouch, this one dyed purple. From it, he drew out something wrapped in oilskin. He carefully unwrapped it, revealing what appeared to Aram to be an enormous acorn, big as the Night Elf's fist. The druid waved the acorn over the planted seeds, while chanting quietly in a language Aram couldn't understand. Within seconds, shoots popped out from the soil. And within minutes, Thalos had harvested a large assortment of good-sized yams and turnips, sengen root and carrots, even multiple handfuls of wind blossom berries. Aram watched the Night Elf carefully rewrap the giant acorn, then put it back in its purple pouch and in his pocket. Then the boy doubled back to camp before he could be noticed. Chapter 22. The Web Tightens. What goes on in the mind of a Murloc? He had been told in no uncertain terms not to go fishing with his nets, and it's not as if he didn't understand why. He knew he had a tendency to get tangled in them. All right, fine. hopelessly tangled in them. This wasn't some new discovery of Urim and Murksa's either. His uncle Murgly often complained of Murky being more trouble than he was worth. It was why Murky fished alone, rather than with his uncle and the other Florlockers. It was why Murky alone wasn't taken when the Rurgers raided. So perhaps the little creature thought he had something to prove. Or perhaps it was the rumbling in his tummy and the fact that Murksa had said that neither she nor Dulles was likely to find meat or vegetable. Yes, Urim had sent him to find firewood, but he had as yet found none. And might he not also net some driftwood along with the fish that would warm his tummy and theirs? He owed them for the food they had already shared. He owed them for his very life. And then, of course, as his gurgling stomach continued to remind him, he owed himself a meal. By Murloc standards, he had barely eaten over the last few weeks. He was quite hungry. He would be careful this time. Very careful. He would not get tangled. He would do as Uncle Murgly had taught him. He would anchor himself carefully and maintain a good grip. He'd swing the nets out over the river, let them fall across the water, let the weights drag the bottom edge down, and let the flow expand the net's reach. He'd wait. Then he would slowly draw them back, maintaining his footing with suction and claw against the pull of the river. He would then pour out his catch onto the rocks. He would do all this, he was sure. It was raining in earnest now, but the cold downpour didn't bother him. He found a likely spot on the shore where he could brace himself against a sturdy stone. He slowly played out his nets. He swung them back and forth, preparing to let them fly. He released his nets. But his thumb claw caught an edge. The large stone stopped him from following the net's momentum into the water, but without the ability to spread forward, the nets chose to swing back around on Murky. He saw them coming and, eyes wide, threw up a hand to stop them. But the hand somehow managed to go right through a square empty space in the webbing. The balance of the net whipped around him like a cocoon. He stifled a mournful cry. He didn't want the others, especially Murksa, who might come back this way any time, to find him like this. To have to set him free yet again, especially after they had told him not to fish. No, this time he must free himself. He leaned back against the rock and tried to push the strands of net up over his head. That didn't work. He then tried to push them down so he could step out of the mess. That didn't work either. Frustrated, he struggled every which way he could, but that only made the situation worse. And worst of all, he wasn't alone. Aram was the first back to camp. He had collected a few pieces of damp driftwood off the shore, but he hadn't searched too hard. He wanted to look well ensconced by the time Thalos returned. And Thalos returned next, leaning on his stick, his pack full of his newly harvested crop. The rain had picked up, and Thalos used a bit of simple druidic magic, simple according to him anyway, to spark a small fire beneath the rocky ledge with Aram's damp wood. He stuck the yams in the coals, took out a small knife, and began to cut the other vegetables into a stew pot. Aram watched all this, and Thalos watched him watching.
"Are you not curious?"
the night elf asked. "About what?"
"Where I found our feast."
"Oh, well, I just assumed you druids know where to look." The druid looked slightly disappointed, losing his smile for perhaps the first time since Aram had met him. But he said,
"That we do, my boy. That we do."
Mikasa came then, with no meat, but more wood. She saw Thalos's vegetables and demanded, "Where did all that come from?" Thalos's smile returned as he said,
"Druids just know where to look."
Mikasa shook her head, dropped her small pile of wood near the fire, and moved in under the ledge on the other side of Aram. "Where's the Murloc?" she asked. "I sent him to gather wood," he said. "He went upriver." "You didn't pass him on the way back?" "No, she said, trying to remember if there was a spot where she might have missed him. Aram more or less read her mind. You don't think he's in the river, do you? All three of them contemplated the likelihood of this, and found it not implausible. Aram said, "Do we give him a few more minutes, or go look for him now?" The storm punctuated the question with an ominous rumble of thunder. All three of them stood as one, sighing as one as well. Aram smelled a whiff of jasmine on the breeze, just before a fourth voice whispered, "Sit back down, my friends." Aram knew that voice even before he spotted the Whisper Man, silhouetted by a flash of lightning. Instantly, Mikasa was on the attack. She lunged with her harpoon. The Whisper Man dodged, but she was prepared, and as he reached to draw his own black sword, her cutlass sliced his arm off at the elbow. This seemed to catch him off guard, though it didn't seem to bother him much. His remaining hand drew out a black shale dagger, and he sliced at her backhanded. She was forced to retreat, but Aram was there to take her place, swinging his cutlass, forcing the undead swordsman to parry with his dagger, and leaving him open to Mikasa's harpoon, which stabbed into his gullet. "Whisper now," she dared him, but he emitted no sound. But silence did not indicate surrender. He wrenched himself sideways, yanking the hilt of the harpoon from a surprised Mikasa's grip. He stabbed his dagger into his own left thigh for safekeeping and tore the harpoon free of his neck. He flipped it and was prepared to throw when a booming voice backed by thunder shouted, "Move!" Instinctively, Mikasa and Aram cleared a path, turning in time to see Thalis rush forward while rapidly transforming into a mighty, ice-colored, rune-marked, silver-eyed bear. The beast slammed into the Whisper Man, who practically shattered into pieces against the granite side of the ravine. Here was a leg, there was another. His head lolled off his torso, only held in place by the pocket of his hood. One forearm still lay where Mikasa had cut it off. "Is he dead?" Aram asked. "Can he die that way?" The bear shook his great head. Mikasa said, "We should burn him." Cautiously, she approached the meager fire, while the other two remained on alert to see what would happen next. And what happened next was the sound of choking. Choking that segued into hoarse laughter, adding a chilling touch to an already chilling scene. His remaining hand reached up to right his head, to lock it back into place with an audible snap, followed by a disgusting squelching noise. The laughter stopped, replaced by the now too familiar sound of his voice. Raising his hand slowly, he pointed at Mikasa and whispered, "I told Malice you could fight. I saw your skill on the boat." The pointing finger moved toward Aram. "You didn't do badly either, young squire. Strife has improved your instincts." Then the Whisper Man lowered his hand back down to his side and lolled his head toward the bear. "But I must say, Night Elf, you were the true surprise tonight. I've killed many a druid over the years, and I've never seen one who could shift quite so fast. You caught me completely off guard, and that's no easy feat." "Why do you follow us, pirate?" demanded Mikasa. "What could we possibly have left that you still want?" But Aram had other concerns. "Where's my captain?" "Your father, you mean? I'm afraid you'll never see him again in this world, my boy." Immediately he wished he hadn't asked the question. If I hadn't asked, I wouldn't know the answer, and as long as I didn't know there was a chance. He realized all eyes were on him. He was afraid he'd cry in front of the enemy, but Aram's anger held back any tears. He said, "I'm not your boy." "No, of course not. And I can understand why I'm not a welcome sight. But the truth is, I didn't come here to fight you. Any of you." "Just to kill us," Mikasa said. "No, not that either. You'll recall I didn't even have my sword out when you attacked me. And if I wanted you dead, I'd have hardly announced myself before striking. Aram smelled the Whisper Man's jasmine water, mixed with the stench of death, and thought the undead killer couldn't help but announce himself. But Aram glanced at Mikasa, who was running the battle back through her mind, confirming the truth of the Forsaken's words. The Whisper Man continued. In addition, if a fight to the death was the plan, I wouldn't have kept my friend, Throg, waiting in the wings. You can come out now, Throg. Mikasa, Aram, and the bear whipped around. Throg was crossing the river. His pike hand caught the glint of another bolt of lightning, which was instantly followed by a crack of thunder that practically seemed to thrum the ogre's name. When he reached shore, the Whisper Man spoke again. That's close enough, Throg. We don't want to initiate another conflict. As I said, that's not why we came, and it would be seriously counterproductive. Mikasa turned back to him and said, What do you want? To make introductions. I am Baron Regal Valdred, or at least I was once upon a time. My companion, as I mentioned, is Throg. We work for Captain Malice. We know from the Wave Striders manifest that you are Mikasa Flintwill and Aramar Thorn. But perhaps you would be so good as to identify your night elf friend. There was silence. Well, perhaps not, whispered Valdred. That's fine. In any case, my message is not for him, but for you, Squire Thorn. Aram glanced from the Whisper Band to Mikasa, to Thalas, to Throg, and back. What message? He asked finally. Captain Malice wanted me to tell you that he does not seek your life. He wants one thing, and one thing only. The compass. Compass? Aram asked. What compass? Protect this compass at all costs, his father had said. The one you wear around your neck. The one you received from your father. Please now, let's not play games. We've been watching you. We know you have it. All right, fine, I have it, Aram said, but it doesn't work. The needle doesn't even point north. Then parting with it will not be a hardship. He's not inclined, Mikasa stated grimly, to give you or your captain anything, ogre or no ogre. Throg growled behind her, and thunder rumbled behind him, as if nature itself had sided with the hidden. Valdred was reaching for a leg, and seemed, or at least pretended, not to have heard her. Oh, no, we didn't think you'd want to cooperate, and that's eminently understandable. But we do have an inducement. Mikasa crouched, ready for another fight. No, not violence, young lady. Must you always jump to that conclusion? He laughed then, still a very unpleasant sound. Well, I suppose that's understandable as well. In any case, we offer young Aramar a simple trade. The compass for the Murloc. What Murloc? Mikasa said, before Aram could speak. More games, really. Again, my companions have been watching you. I'll admit to some surprise that a Murloc, of all things, is of any value to you. But to each his own. What say you, Squire? Which do you value more, the compass or the creature? You have my word that if you hand over our prize, the Murloc will be set free and none of you will be harmed. You think I trust your word? Aram spat. I haven't lied to you yet, have I? In any case, I'm not sure what choice you have if you want your pet back. He's not a pet. I meant no disrespect, and I don't mean to put you on the spot. You have until sunrise to decide. But let me be clear. The only way you'll ever see the Murloc again is by turning over the compass. If you don't, it dies. And that won't stop us from coming after you either. In the end, Malice will have that compass. So be smart, young squire. And this can all end come the dawn. It was an exit line, but Valdred still couldn't quite reach his leg. He drummed his fingers in frustration against his chest. Finally, he called out, "Throg, help me gather up my parts." Throg started forward. Mikasa, Aram, and the bear stayed on the alert, but they cleared a path as the ogre attempted to pick up Valdred's loose arm and 2 legs. But 3 limbs were too many for a one-handed ogre, and he kept dropping one or another. Valdred whispered, "Just give me one of them, any of them." Throg threw him an arm, which slapped the Whisper Man across the face, knocking off his hood, revealing his pale, skull-like head with a now dislocated jaw. He quickly snapped the jaw back into place and then, scowling, reattached the arm with a click of bones and further unearthly squelching. The scent of jasmine wafted strongly, and Aram felt his gorge rise. He managed to swallow it back down, but he thought he'd never be able to bear even a hint of jasmine again. The ogre, meanwhile, had managed to spear both of Valdred's legs on the tip of his pike hand. He clomped over to the undead swordsman and pushed both legs off the pike into what there was of the Whisper Man's lap. Valdred spent some time reattaching them, clicking the bones in place and allowing what passed for his skin to squelch back together, all while biting his thin lip between his teeth in concentration. Then he pulled his hood back over his head and stood with surprising ease. Almost as an afterthought, he removed the shale dagger from his left thigh and resheathed it. Finally, he was prepared to depart. Mikasa said, "You are resilient, Baron, but also fragile. One of these nights you may find—" "Yes, yes," regal Valdred said with a hint of impatience. "In the end, I am a dead man." He and Throg walked right past them, but he paused to speak again. "We'll leave you to your decision. But please, young squire, make it the right one." And then they were gone, leaving Aram, Mikasa, and the bear Thalys standing in the rain. Chapter 23. Diversions in the Flow. The 3 of them were back beneath the ledge and out of the rain. Lightning still lit the sky on occasion, but the thunder came only after a great delay. The storm was moving on. Thalys, having shifted back into his elven form, asked,
"What is this compass? What is its significance?"
It was a question Mikasa wanted an answer for as well. She had seen the compass many times, of course, around Aram's neck and, before that, around her captain's, but she'd never thought much about it until now. She favored Aram with a penetrating look, one that caused him to turn away. With a reluctance he couldn't quite understand, Aram pulled the compass out from under his shirt and showed it to the other 2. On this cloudy night, there was no sun or constellation to compare it to, but both Mikasa and Thalys instantly saw the needle did not point north.
"This is the prize," said the druid with no little confusion. "The prize for which these pirates, who are clearly not pirates, killed your captain and crew?"
"It's not even working," Mikasa said darkly. "It's pointing southeast." "Yeah, I know," Aram said. They were all silent. Thalys's tongue tapped against his upper lip thoughtfully, but he and Mikasa were stumped. Aram had more information, but again felt a bizarre disinclination to speak. Ultimately, though, he knew he had no choice. "Graydon, my father, gave it to me." He turned to Mikasa during the pirate attack, just before he ordered us into the dinghy. "He told me to protect it at all costs." "Then that settles it," said Mikasa immediately and firmly. "We must not hand it over. Had it been worthless, I wouldn't give it to the murderers of our crew. But now, there's no question." "But Murky—" Aram had no more desire to give up the compass than Mikasa. "But what other choice do we have?" "I am sorry about the Murloc," Second Mate Flintwill replied, "but he means nothing to us when compared to following the final orders of Captain Thorne." Aram shook his head. Those may have been his final orders, but they don't match up with his many lessons. Lessons of loyalty to his crew, his onboard family. Mikasa, you know this. I do. But Murky is not crew, not family. Isn't he, though? Aram asked. Are the four of us not a crew on this voyage across Feralis? No! A crewman has worth, serves a purpose. What has this Murloc done to prove himself worthy? Given us one fish? Caught by accident? He's done nothing to prove himself worthy, Aram agreed, but everything to prove himself loyal. Besides, this isn't about proof. What did I ever do aboard Wavestrider to prove my worth? Beyond being our captain's son. He could see he had scored a point. She had spent too many months believing Aram to be as worthless as she now regarded Murky. She grumbled, "It's only been a few days. It's not the same at all. We are no crew here." Murky signed on with us as surely as if he'd penned his name on a manifest. I doubt he can write his name, Urum. Stop it, Aram said, getting angry. I know you better than that. You don't know me. I don't know your story, but I know your heart, sister. Don't pretend otherwise. The word sister worked its magic on her. She stopped arguing. He didn't. We don't rescue shipmates because they've proven their worth. We rescue them to prove our own. It sounded like something Graydon would say, though Aram had never exactly heard Graydon say it. Just then, Thalos held out his hand.
May I see it, Aram? May I hold it?
Aram, his head still swirling from his argument with Mikasa, looked at him uncomprehendingly.
The compass,
Thalos said. Aram felt that same hesitancy. The Kaldori said,
I may be able to discern some sense of its purpose, its value to your father and to his slayers.
I think its purpose is to point my way home, to Lakeshire. My father told me as much when he gave it to me. The Night Elf frowned.
Any compass, any map for that matter, could help get you home.
He still held out his hand. Aram glanced at Mikasa, but she was looking inward. So he relented and lifted the chain off his neck, offering it to Thalos. The druid held the compass in the palm of his left hand. He felt the weight of it. He closed his eyes. He held his right hand palm down a few inches above it. He chanted something brief in Darnassian and felt a power, weak but definitely present, magnetizing the compass in some anomalous manner. He opened his eyes and spoke.
The needle is made of crystal, but not the crystal of the deep earth. It is a shard of pure starlight from the heavens, imbued with the celestial spark.
Aram said, What does that mean?
Simply put, it means the crystal needle is not of this world. There is an enchantment of some kind upon it. Unfortunately, this is beyond my expertise. My powers favor the flora of the clean earth, its plants and trees. I can discover nothing else of this device.
He handed the compass back to Aram, who quickly hung the chain back around his neck and tucked it under his shirt. Aram's thoughts were a jumble. Thalos was right. A working compass and the maps from the dinghy would have done just as much to point him homeward as this enchanted thing. But then, what was his father thinking? If the compass held more secrets, Graydon knew them. He must. How many times had his father hinted there was more to their journey than met the eye? Even his mother had hinted as much the day she sent him from Lakeshire. At the end, Graydon Thorne had regretted being out of time. But there had been 6 months to tell Aram the truth. Captain Thorne could make time for daily lessons in trivia and humiliation, but not for the essential reason he had brought Aram on the voyage in the first place? What kind of father brings his son aboard ship, knowing there would be danger from those seeking the compass? What kind of father gives that compass to his son and adopted daughter, knowing that danger would follow wherever they went? If the compass must be kept from the hands of this malice, why had he not simply thrown it into the sea? Like Aram, the other two were lost in their own thoughts. Thalos emerged first. He said,
I cannot tell you more of the compass, but I can tell you this. I believe it is why I was drawn to you both in the first place.
Mikasa raised her eyes to Thalos like two daggers. I thought you were traveling to Gadget-san.
And so I was. I did not speak false, nor did I reveal all.
Reveal it now, she demanded. He nodded and spoke.
You know what I am. A druid, at one with this world, in sync with its energies. Some nights past, I felt a presence, a detour in my own road. If I have calculated correctly, I believe that must have been the night you two made landfall. It drew me forward, drew me to you both like the needle of a working compass. From the moment I first laid eyes on you both, I felt a kinship. To be perfectly honest, the feeling was so intense I did not quite trust it. I watched you for a time to see how you lived off the land. Then I saw you rescue Murky, observed how you behaved toward the poor little creature, and I knew our encounter was destiny.
There's no such thing, Mikasa growled.
There is, young warrior. There is a harmony to nature, a way and a flow, like the path of a river, like the path through the soil that a stem takes to find the sun. Do you think it is any different for beings such as we four travelers?
She didn't respond. He continued,
I am not talking of guarantees. A river may be dammed, a stem may be chewed away by aphids or grasshoppers, and a traveler may be diverted in any number of ways. But the flow exists, and we are without a doubt a part of its whole.
Aram mused on flows for a time. He was still angry with Graydon, but it was not an anger he could easily sustain when he remembered what the Whisper Man had said.
I'm afraid you'll never see him again in this world.
Graydon Thorne was dead. His father was dead. This wasn't about obeying the man's final orders as a captain. This was about honoring, or at least attempting to honor, his final wishes as a father. Mikasa said stubbornly,
We're not giving them the compass.
Maybe not, Aram said, but one way or another, we have to rescue Murky. It's a shame they never got the chance. They came up with a decent plan a good hour before dawn and broke camp, though they left the fire burning under the ledge so that anyone watching from a distance would still believe they were waiting for Malice and his crew. Mikasa and Thalos might not be quite the trackers Zathra was, and they could find no trace whatsoever of Valdred's footsteps, but the ogre was not being half so careful. Throg's was an easy trail to follow. Silently as possible, they moved through the gorge, upriver. Thalos heard something first, and signaled the others to hide behind some rocks. Seconds later, a huge form, the ogre, emerged in silhouette, not 5 yards ahead of them. They scanned about for the Whisper Man or the Troll or Malice. Then Aram glanced back at the ogre as he turned. He managed to swallow his gasp. This ogre had 2 hands. Then a second ogre joined the first, and then a third. How many ogres did Malice have? The 3 ogres murmured to one another, too quietly for Aram or Mikasa to make out. But Thalos's pointed ears were sharper, and he clearly didn't like what he was hearing. He signaled their need to get out of there. Easier signaled than done. Thalos pointed to a slim crevice between 2 large stones and led the way. Aram followed, and Mikasa, her harpoon and cutlass at the ready, took up the rear. But choosing the crevice turned out to be a significant tactical error. Thalos emerged from between the rocks to find a 4th ogre standing with his broad back to the gap. The night elf had moved silently and had not yet been discovered. But this was no way out. He signaled Aram to turn around. The boy complied and signaled Mikasa to do the same. Unfortunately, by this time the sky was clearing and the light of a full moon glistened off Mikasa's sword as she turned. It caught the eye of one of the ogres, and roaring, he charged at Mikasa Flintwill. She strode forward to meet that charge, ducked under the swing of the brute's massive club, and slashed him from belly button to breastbone with her sword. But the other 2 ogres were upon her. "Run!" she called to Aram as she threw her harpoon between the eyes of the second ogre, but her newly declared brother wasn't about to leave her behind, even assuming there was anywhere to go. He drew his sword, but wasn't sure what to do with it. Mikasa unleashed her iron chain, swinging it in tight circles to keep the third ogre at bay. Thalos whispered to Aram to move. The boy was blocking the night elf from emerging from the crevice, which was too tight to allow him to shapeshift into either bear or stag. Suddenly, the 2 stones Thalos stood between were pulled asunder from behind by the broad-backed ogre. Thalos tried to turn to face this new threat, but the ogre's club came down on the back of the night elf's head, and antlers or no antlers, the druid fell unconscious at Broadback's feet. The ogre put 2 pinky fingers in his mouth and whistled, loud and shrill. Aram turned, but Broadback slapped the cutlass from the boy's hand and grabbed him up, tucking him under one massive arm. Aram called out, but Mikasa was still trying to keep her own opponent at bay. With some effort, the boy managed to draw the hunting knife from his belt and stab the ogre in the ribs. But Broadback simply shifted Aram to his other arm, pulled the knife out, and tossed it into the nearby river. Seeing she had no choice, Mikasa changed tack, intentionally allowing the chain to slacken as if her arm were tired, luring the ogre in. The instant he took a step forward, she swung the chain upward, shattering the monster's jaw. He roared in pain and dropped to his knees. She stepped forward and quickly ended his life. That just left Broadback, who stood over an unconscious Thalos and had a struggling Aram tucked under one arm. With his free hand, the ogre scooped up Aram's cutlass. Without a word or a grunt, Broadback held it against Aram's neck, forcing the boy to become still. Broadback and Mikasa faced each other grimly. Neither made a sound. But within seconds, heavy footsteps approached from upriver and down, summoned by Broadback's whistle. Ogres. More than Aram could count from his current, rather limited vantage, came to a stop on either side of the standoff. Mikasa quickly did her own math. She sheathed her bloody cutlass and let her chain hang limp. Broadback chuckled, guttural and dark. Then Mikasa reached for the harpoon that still stuck out of the second ogre. Ogres on both sides took a threatening step forward. Broadback stopped chuckling. She pulled her harpoon free and launched herself backward. She fell into the river with a splash and went limp, allowing the current, swift from the recent rains, to carry her downstream. A few of the ogres threw spears. Aram couldn't see, but he heard no cry and had to hope the ogres had missed their target. He did not for one moment feel abandoned. He knew in his soul Mikasa would never leave him to die. She had done what she had to do to escape and fight another day. His sister would come for him, attempt a rescue. Of this, he had no doubt at all. In the meantime, Aram's job was to stay alive. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. But that was unacceptable. He couldn't allow himself to fall silent every time he was in crisis. Not if crises continued to come upon him so fast and furious. He cleared his throat and, trying to keep his voice from cracking, said, "Fine. You caught me. Bring me to Malice. We'll make our trade." Broadback lifted Aram up so they could look each other in the eye. The ogre leaned in. His rank breath filled Aram's nostrils. His single horn came close to grazing Aram's forehead. Aram swallowed hard and repeated, "Bring me to Malice." Broadback snorted and threw the boy over his shoulder as if he were a sack of flour, and not a particularly full sack at that. "Bring me to Malice. The whisper... Valdred promised we'd be safe if we agreed to Malice's terms." Broadback finally spoke. Rather dismissively, he said,
"I know. No Malice, no Valdard. We bring you to Gordok, king of the Dire Mol Gorduni."
He stepped away from Thalos and pointed him out to another ogre.
"You and Night Elf will please Gordok well. He tired of watching Burlocks die. He seek fresher sport."
Finally, Aram understood. These were not Malice's ogres. These were of the marauding clan that had raided Murky's village, taken his uncle, his aunt, and everyone he knew. Hanging behind Broadback, Aram could just see another ogre heft the unconscious Thalos onto his shoulder before the march began. Within minutes, they were out of the gorge and still climbing. Within the hour, they were already heading northeast into the mountains. Aram had no idea where Mikasa was now, how close she was, or how far. And though he still had the compass tucked under his shirt, he knew that with each step the ogres took, Murky's chances of rescue and survival receded farther into the distance. Part 3. Above Sky Peak. Chapter 24. Fears of a Burlap Sack. Aram spent the first miles draped over Broadback's shoulder. It was uncomfortable and humiliating, but he'd be blasted if he was going to cooperate with his own abduction. Let the ogre tire himself out carrying me. But step after jarring step, mile after tortuous mile, it gradually became clear Broadback wasn't likely to tire soon. By the time Thalos regained consciousness and asked, rather politely, Aram thought, to be put down to walk on his own, Aram was ready to add his voice to that particular chorus. Without stopping, Broadback addressed them both.
Slaves try to run. Slaves travel rest of way in sack. Slaves go too slow. Slaves travel rest of way in sack. Slaves talk at all. Slaves travel rest of way in sack. Understood.
Thalos said,
Understood.
Aram said, yeah. Both were unceremoniously dumped on their rear ends on the stony ground. One good shove from Broadback made it instantly clear they could rub their backsides as they marched, not before. So they marched, in the center of a diamond-shaped phalanx of 6 ogres, including Broadback directly behind them. There was no way Aram could attempt escape, even if he was willing to risk the sack, which hung limply over the shoulder of one of the ogres he followed. The large burlap sack might have been currently empty, but the threat of it clearly was not. The pace they maintained was brutal, unmercifully based on the longer stride of the large ogres heading up the relatively steep incline. But slowing had earned him another rough shove from Broadback, so breathing hard, he made very sure he matched their gait. They passed ruins to the south. Aram's eyes widened over broken towers, broken columns, and semi-collapsed sections of palaces, or perhaps temples, grander than any intact structure he had ever seen in his life. Even as he marched between ogres in clearly dire circumstances, he found himself wishing he had his freedom, not simply to run, but to explore these fallen edifices. He racked his brain to access his father's lessons in order to identify the decaying buildings passing on his right. He thought maybe they were the ruins of Isildian. He assumed the Night Elf would know, but there was no way to confirm his guess without speaking, and no way to speak without winding up in a burlap sack. The Kaldori, meanwhile, lowered his head to mourn. It was not the first time, or even the 100th time, he had seen Isildian in the 10 millennia since the city had been destroyed. But every time was just as painful as the first. 10,000 years ago, Isildian had been nothing short of glorious. And now it was reduced to this fractured shadow of itself. And the worst part, he knew, was that the Night Elves had brought this fate upon themselves by abusing the very arcane powers they had believed were their birthright. It was why he, like many of his people, now shunned the arcane, and used only the druidic magic of nature. It was balanced, it was safe, and it was his penance. Thalos looked up, and he and Aram exchanged glances. It suddenly occurred to Aram that the druid no longer had his staff to rest upon. The ogres had left it behind by the river, yet it didn't seem to trouble the Kaldori. Aram wondered if the druid ever really needed it at all. He also wondered if Thalys, who offered Aram a sympathetic smile, considered shape-shifting his way out of their captivity. Aram briefly fantasized, grabbing hold of an antler and swinging himself up onto the great stag's back as the transformation caught the ogres off guard, allowing their hostages to make a break for it. But many of the ogres had spears, and there was no cover in sight. The fantasy ended unpleasantly as Aram pictured himself in the sack while the ogres enjoyed venison for supper. He ran a similar scenario with Thalys's bear form, and it ended with similar results. He wondered what other animals the night elf might be capable of, but no creature he could think of, shy of a dragon, seemed to promise success. He wondered about Mikasa. He knew with absolute certainty she would come for him, and he tried to calculate when she might make her move. As he marched, he counted the ogres in the company. In addition to Broadback and the other 5 surrounding Aram and Thalys, numerous glances over his shoulder revealed 7 more ogres taking up the rear. 13 ogres in the cold light of dawn seemed too many even for the mighty Flintwill to chance an assault. She was a warrior. The 3 ogres she had dispatched before sunrise proved that, but she was also smart enough to wait for her moment. This would not be the time. And at this time, Aram's heart was full and troubled. Yes, Mikasa would come. She'd come for him, for her brother, the last brother she had on this earth. He knew this, and he knew that meant she had not risked attempting to rescue poor Murky. Sunrise had come and gone, and Malice did not have the compass. By now, the funny little Murloc was dead. Aram bit his lip and wiped his eyes. Surrounded by ogres, he couldn't afford to shed any overt tears, but in his heart he lit a candle for Murky and hoped the Murloc's gods would treat him well. Sunrise had found Malice, Sarbeak, Valdred, and Throg standing over the cold fire pit beneath the ledge.
Satisfied?
The Arakoa complained.
You and your games. Why would you think the boy would ever trade the prize for a lowly Murloc? Were you afraid to take the compass by force? Or are you just that big of a fool?
Malice moved so suddenly, Sarbeak was caught completely off guard. The big man grabbed the sorcerer by the throat and lifted. Sarbeak's feet quickly cleared the ground.
Try to chant your way out of this,
Malice said. Sarbeak choked and struggled in his captain's grip.
I don't care whom you serve, Birdman. Forget your place again, and I will wring your neck like a chicken's.
He opened his hand, and the Arakoa dropped to the ground, gasping for breath, wheezing through his beak. Sarbeak shot Malice a murderous look, but Malice ignored it. Baron Valdred chuckled audibly. Throg looked away. He was secretly pleased, but not so secretly frightened of the sorcerer's magic. He didn't want to give Sarbeak reason to take revenge later. Murky noticed few of these details. He was still hanging off the ogre's shoulder, wrapped in his own nets and his own thoughts. He saw that his friends were gone, that they had left him with his abductors. He realized sadly that he wasn't too surprised. He had only just met the Kalduri, and Murksa had stated more than once that she wanted to leave Murky behind. But he had thought Urim would try to help, had hoped that maybe his new friend would not abandon him. And it broke his heart just a bit to learn he was wrong. When Malice sighed and said to Throg,
"Kill the Murloc,"
a small piece of Murky thought his death now would be a mercy. He had lost his family, his village, and now his new friends. There was no place for him in this world. Just then, Zathra returned. Malice turned to her.
"Did you find their trail?"
"In a way,"
she said, smiling grimly and pausing for effect. Malice was in no mood for guessing games.
"Well, out with it."
"They be ambushed not far from here. Ogres."
She glanced at Throg.
"Some branch of the Gurduni clan."
Throg harumphed loudly. Malice mused on this revelation.
"I know of the Gorduni. Their king is Gordok. Actually, that's what they call all their kings. Not that it matters.
He returned his focus to the troll, saying,
What did you find?
The human female killed 3 of them ogres. Their bodies be left behind, and I can tell by the wounds.
Can you track them?
Ogre tracks be clear to see, be leading up into the mountains toward Isildian. But there be no tracks for the elf or the humans. No bodies either. So they be taken and carried off.
Carried off? Alive or dead?
asked Malice.
There be no human blood there, and only a speck of elf blood. So unless the ogres strangled them, they're probably alive.
Throg said,
Ogres not take dead humans or dead elf along.
Not even to eat? Whispered an amused Valdred. Throg considered this and shrugged. He said,
Elf meat tastes horrible, but stag meat and bear meat good. Human meat stringy, but stringy good sometimes, if Throg in mood.
He started to drool. Valdred encouraged him.
How would you prepare the boy? Would you use spices?
Throg started to answer.
Cook with blood in carcass,
he said. Zathra shook her head in disgust.
You insane, brother, she said. You gotta drain the boy first. There be hardly any meat, so you be wanting to strip what there be off the bones. Maybe make jerky out of him.
Throg shrugged again.
Still better to take alive and eat fresh.
Fools! What of the compass?
Gasped an exasperated Sarbeak, each syllable painfully tearing up his still sore throat.
Still with the boy I be bitten, said the troll. No reason to think it be of any interest to the Gorduni.
Throg added,
Ogres can't eat compass.
Valdred, who was enjoying the conversation,